When I was in it, first of all, it was a shorter class. Secondly, I was fresh out of school and didn't have anything else to do. But I know probably all of you have lots of other things to do. And I appreciate and respect that. So let me know if I can help, give you suggestions. If you have struggles, keep me in the loop. Happy to do what I can. If you wouldn't mind, go ahead and put your names in the chat for me. Hopefully you've been reading ahead, and you might have had a fun time with this chapter 2. It's got lots of fun new words. Thankfully, a lot of those words aren't things that you really need to embrace too much on the regular daily once you're in the business. But once to get the license to take this exam, you do need to know what these things are. So we're going to dive deep into those things. And we had started touching on 2 just when we parted ways last week. So let's recap a little bit. All right, there we go. We are live streaming. That's a good thing. So don't forget you have that access. After the fact, you can always kind of revisit some things, especially when we get to the calculations. Might be helpful to be able to pause and rewind. Also, let's recap a couple other things first. There's the YouTube channel. If you go to it and just see 2 videos, that's because these are the only 2 that were pre-recorded. Most of the content on this channel is live stream. So you've got a whole class worth from the last time around that I did this for another class. And then you'll just notice from the duration, like when did it get streamed as to when it happened. Obviously, at this point, test prep, and this one a month ago. Anything a month or more ago was the previous class, so you can kind of keep track of it by date. And then I have another one. Don't forget about the other one, and that's called Impact. Impact Broker Coach. And that's just more of the same, except I added some individual things. These are the oldest things I've got. And once we get to the math, it'll matter a little more to you. But I've got these little tutorials, these little narrated tutorials of me and an iPad and talking to you. No camera, just voiceover. And then the ones that are closest to that also have math things as well. And then it's a whole other class worth of information, including if you check out the live stream, it's another pre-class just for a different entity. A couple other resources you might find or have heard about, and I'll just go ahead and give you my 2 cents on them. This gentleman, Travis Everett, he's been around a long time. He's got lots of content as well. The same book as we use. And he's been doing it many, many years. In fact, he already had content when I started teaching. So I watched his stuff to get up to speed faster on what I needed to teach. And, different style, different slides. So it might be just another resource. Sometimes it's nice to hear from a different voice. And I'm sure there's some other stuff that you'll run into. Let me think. I think this one might be, maybe. I'm not sure. if you find something on your own, just run it by me. Let me see if I know something about it, give you some insight. And if you hear something on these other ones that contradicts what we talk about, absolutely let me know. Let's get to the bottom of that. I've found mistakes on others' material before, so just be careful. I pay for I think it's like $13 a month for the YouTube Premiere subscription. It's not the TV one, but it's the one that lets me turn my screen off on my phone and still hear the audio. So then I can just throw it in my pocket, put in the earbuds, work out, mow the grass, do the housekeeping, whatever. Drive. I guess you could listen legally while driving. Just don't look at the screen, right? I would never do that. Okay, let's pick it up at Deep Sea. That was the first acronym we saw last time, and it stands for the bundle of legal rights that we have access to, that we, when we own property, get to enjoy. The right to dispose of it, or disposition. A lot of times the big words, 3 or more syllables, they all stem from shorter words. So don't just think, oh, that's a big word. What in the world does that mean? It just means dispose of, essentially, right? You're throwing it away, giving it away. You're removing the property from yourself, in other words. So the right to disposition, selling it or giving it away. Some people give away real estate. The right to enjoy it. The right of exclusion. You can keep people out, put fences up, not allow for security reasons. The right to possess it. So the right to ownership includes the right that you have to possess it, but you could not own the property and still have the right to possess it. What are you called when you have the right to possess something that you don't own? If anybody, I'm seeing a couple of people with some issues, either audio or video. Try the go out and come back in solution. That often will work. So let's give that a shot first if you're having trouble. How many of you actually own your own home? Hands up in the video. Got a couple. How many of you are renting? So as renters, you get to possess that property. You get to come and go, let yourself in and out, occupy it, sleep in it. You don't own it, but you have the right to possession, right? So this is talking about ownership. So obviously as part of being an owner, you have the right to possess amongst those other things. You as renters can't dispose of it. You can't sell it, but you can occupy it according to your rental agreement. And then as an owner, you have the right to control it. And these rights stem from what we saw in chapter 1, the air rights, the surface rights, and the subsurface rights. It's more than just coming and going from the structure of the house, but the right to dig down in the ground as far as you want to go and pull out things, oil, mineral, gas. Once upon a time, not too long ago, there was a home builder. I might have said this already. D.R. Horton Home Builder came to North Carolina and reserved the right in their sales contracts when they sold new construction to dig and drill for mineral oil or gas. They reserved the right for those subsurface rights until some owners who bought nice new construction homes saw it finally. They didn't see it when they signed it, but they noticed later when somebody maybe rolled down the street in a big old truck, started drilling into the ground. That was a problem. And so they finally gave in and said, okay, we won't do this anymore. So watch for that. The lesson there is, who owns the rights to your property? You do? Do you own all 3 of them? The air rights and the subsurface rights along with the surface rights? I saw something, I think just from a couple years ago, that D.R. Horton ran into the same thing again in Florida. So read the contract. And as a broker, that's on us. Let's make sure that we read that contract. Remember, when we get to I believe it's chapters 9 and 10, on contracts, we're going to see the standard contract that we use and how it's got some provisions that keep it fair between the parties, keeps it balanced between the buyer and the seller. But you don't have to only use that one. Your clients are not restricted to only using that standard contract called the NCAR Form 2T, standard contract, offer to purchase and contract, they can use anything they want. And a builder is probably going to have their own contract made from their own attorney. And it's going to lean hard toward the builder's side, right? So you got to read the fine print. You're not an attorney, but you do need to help your client understand the thing. And I like to compare it to the standard form. We'll get into something here shortly called excise tax. It's essentially a sales tax. And the standard form 2T says the seller pays for that excise tax. It's essentially $1 per $500 of sale price. So if the property sells for $300,000, that's going to be $600 of excise tax. So the standard one says the seller's going to pay it, but that's not a legal requirement. The builder's contract, when they have their own attorney write one up, usually moves it on over to the buyer's side, makes the buyer pay for it. So little things like that. So just be watching out for what rights. So when you go into list a property, it's a good question to ask that seller. What rights do you have in this property? All of them? And it's part of that listing agreement that'll kind of prompt you to ask those questions. So we talked about real property. That's the land plus the improvements and then plus the bundle of legal rights, those rights that you have because you own the property. And that's what this chapter is largely about. We got into these very specific Latin phrases talking about foliage, essentially, right? Things that are growing on the property. Was it planted there? If so, was it planted there in order to be cultivated later, like a farmer does to dig it up and to sell those crops? Then that's called fructus industrialis, or fruits of industry. And the reason that matters is that fruits of industry are personal property, not real property. Yes, they're growing in the ground. And when we talk about fixtures, we learn that fixtures are pretty much attached to the real estate, attached to the ground. But in this case, it's sort of an exception. Fruits of industry, corn, beans, wheat, grain, whatever is planted for the purpose of cultivating and then selling, that's considered personal property, even though it looks like a fixture. And why that matters is because if that farmer sells their acreage, but they still have a crop of corn that hasn't matured yet, not ready to be picked, they have the right to come back after closing and cultivate it, dig it up, reap it, and sell it. And then normal coming back every year kinds of plants, trees, plants, those are called fruits of the soil. They don't require cultivation. They're coming whether you plant them over and over again or not. They're just always coming back. Azaleas, shrubbery, trees, things like that. And so that's classified as real property. So when you sell a house that has 3 trees in the front yard and 5 trees in the backyard and 14 shrubs, unless the parties to the contract agree otherwise, those should still be there at closing. When you come for the walkthrough before closing, that owner can't just dig those up and take them with them unless the parties agreed to it in writing. They're assumed that they're real property, so they're assumed that they're going to be staying. That has happened before. I know of a broker who sold a house to her buyers. She was their agent, the buyer agent. They had lovely yellow flowers lining the sidewalk on the way to the front door. She went for the walkthrough before closing. Everything looked great. They went to closing. After closing, she came back to the house. She met them back at the house they had just bought to give them their closing gift and just to kind of, hug it out and just to say thank you. And when they all got there at the same time, those yellow flowers were gone. Come to find out, the flowers had never been removed from the pots. They were just sitting in the pots, in holes, in the ground. And that was what the listing agent said to her when she called her. Buyers were upset. She called the listing agent. Listing agent said, "I'm sorry, but those were never real property. Those were in pots in the ground." And through that technicality, they kind of didn't have much to go on. And so guess who went about buying, gosh, I forgot how many she said, like 50. It was about $800 worth. She chose to do this. They didn't make her. But just to end things, to make her client happy, sometimes we need to keep on the side in our transaction what I call happiness money. Money that we're prepared to spend to keep everybody behaving and or happy when little weird things like this pop up. And she did that. She spent the money, made them happy, went around, gathered up all these, I think they were geraniums or something, and got them planted same day just to kind of preserve the happiness of the occasion. Things that run with the land. Another big word to write down in your notebook that could be tested on. Don't forget, keep your little notes off to the side. I'll say things sometimes like, this is testable. I've seen this on practice exams. So something so you can quickly jot a little note like that down is important. But appurtenance is a good word to remember. An appurtenance is a thing or right or a privilege, a legal right or privilege that runs with the land. It's included in your ownership. We talked about the subsurface, the surface, and the air rights. And then typically, unless accounted for otherwise, the sale includes all three of them. You get all three: subsurface, surface, and air rights. We left off with this stuff: water rights. If it's water that does not have a tide, doesn't have a tides that come in and go out, those are called riparian rights. Riparian rights. If it's water that does have tidal activity, like tides come in, go out, high tide, low tide, that's larger bodies of water. Obviously the ocean, but even large lakes, Lake Superior, Huron, Michigan, those big lakes actually have tidal activity. So anything with a tide has appurtenant rights included called littoral rights. And so let's dig into that a little bit. The riparian rights specifically, the ones that are not tidal, you're either going to have a big lake that essentially boats could go on, navigable. And in that case, what you own, if you own that water frontage, you own just to the edge of the water. Lake Norman people who live on the lake, they don't own to the center of Lake Norman. They own to the edge of the water because that's a navigable lake. However, the non-navigable things, smaller streams, things like that, you own out to the center of that body of water. You don't own just to the edge. You could go out to the center and that's still yours. So that's riparian, things that don't have tides. Littoral rights, things with tides, what you own is all the way just to the high tide line. How far in does it come? You notice that sand is kind of maybe, gosh, it might be 6 feet tall right there because the ocean comes up to that point and then recedes back. It never goes beyond that point. That's the high tide line. When the tide is out, there could be 50 feet between that break point, that red line, and where the water is coming up to in that moment. Essentially twice a day, right? Comes in high tide, low tide. So what do you own? If you own beachfront property, you own to the red line, to the high tide line. There was in the news, I believe it was New Jersey, maybe Governor Chris Christie at the time, and he made the headlines because he ran some people off from in front of his beachfront house because they were walking across the beach. And I believe it was low tide, but it just so happens in New Jersey, this isn't the same rule. In New Jersey, it's not the high tide line, it's all of it, even to the low tide. So he was actually in the right. Whether he was a jerk or not remains to be seen. But in North Carolina, what you own is to the high tide line. That's part of your littoral rights. Couple other things. You could get more land by this thing called accretion. That means the water movement is bringing in soil deposits, maybe because of storm, like excessive winds and storming. And that soil that gets excess deposited by the water movement, that's yours too. You also own that through accretion. Now, it might go away overnight. right? Because it'll go as easy as it came. But gaining land through accretion is another way somebody can get land added to their property. That's when water deposits the soil. You could also gain land because the water goes away. And I know we've all seen examples of drought, water receding. If you've ever driven across a bridge on Lake Norman or any lake in a particularly dry summer, and you can see the band in North Carolina, we have red clay, right? The band of red clay around the edge. Well, those property owners now have 3 or 4 more feet of land because it's been uncovered by the water. What can they really do with it? Probably not much. But that gaining of land through water receding is called reliction. So 2 words there. Water receding and giving you more land is called reliction. I just think of receding, reliction. And then soil deposited because of water is called accretion. I just think maybe added, the word accretion, addition, that might be a memory aid there. So 2 ways to gain land, accretion and reliction. Now, how could we lose land? Erosion. We've all seen it, especially like a new construction area or a particularly steep part of the yard where grass can't really take root because the water just keeps, when it rains, the water just keeps kind of washing away the seed. And so it just gradually wears away the land because of this water runoff activity. That's erosion. Losing land because of the gradual wearing away of it by water is called erosion. And I think we're all pretty used to this one and know this word, but this one might be new. Sudden tearing away of land, maybe from a hurricane or an earthquake or flooding. That's called avulsion. Losing land suddenly because of natural disaster, avulsion. So, erosion and avulsion are ways that you can lose land, and then reliction and accretion are ways that you can gain land with water, with having to do with water rights. There are some supportive rights that run with the land too. Maybe the lots are kind of steep. From as you're driving down the street, you notice the street is on an incline or a decline. And one house is higher up than the house next door to it, and that's higher than the one next door to it. So they might put in a retaining wall like what we see here on the left. And what that retaining wall is accomplishing is it's providing lateral support, lateral rights. The sides of the land is supported. That's called lateral support rights. Side to side, like lateral delt raises when you're lifting weights. If you allow the digging or drilling up from underneath the ground, then when those who are digging up minerals, oil or gas, or pulling that out of the ground, it creates voids under there. And so they need to provide support to make up for having taken away material. And that's called subjacent support rights. Subjacent. Think subsurface, because underneath the surface, they're taking out stuff. So they need to put a support in there to keep sinkholes from happening, to keep the house from falling into a sinkhole. So subjacent is supporting the surface of the land. Lateral is supporting the sides of the land. And these are all just level 1 knowledge. You just need to know the definitions. Subjacent means subsurface support. Lateral means side support. And that's about the extent of it. So with all of that said, how many deeds could there be on any one particular property? How many deeds? There you go. Could be as many as 3. You bet. Could be 3 owners for one property. Subsurface, surface, and air rights. Someone asked, if the high tide line changes because of a hurricane, does your ownership change? So as far as for the test, they won't test you to that level. But in real life, if that sort of thing occurred and you had a client who was wondering about it, I would defer to the attorney to get the the take on that. But according to the rule that we've read here, the high tide line is what your ownership is. So that's where it goes to. But in real life, as a broker, you would never give an opinion about such a thing. When a property is transferred to a new owner, what happens to the water rights? Those riparian and literal rights, what happened to those with the new ownership? There you go. They are appurtenant to the property. Therefore, they transfer to the new owner. Part of that ownership. Real property has some characteristics. It is immovable and indestructible. So what you have here with real property, again, is the land, that nice yard, everything on it naturally, those shrubs and trees, and the improvements attached by people, that house. And the driveway, for that matter. Maybe if there's a pool in the back or another detached shed in the back. And then what's not mentioned on this slide, but we just studied, is also including the legal rights. The legal rights. Let's talk about some personal property. It's the stuff you can move. You guys answered that real easy last week. Personal property. Another word for that, by the way, that you could see is personalty. It's just sort of like how realty is a shortened version of real property. Personalty is a short version of personal property. It's everything that's not the real property. Things that you can pick up and walk away with. The stuff the movers deal with, right? They throw it on a truck for you. The cars, too. Movable things, portable things. And that's what makes real estate so unique and also more enticing to investors and to people who fund mortgages. Those who loan money for house loans feel confident because they know that their collateral is not going to disappear. Can't. It's immovable. Fixtures are a big part of our business. Fixtures are not personal property, are they? In fact, in this picture, are there any fixtures that we can see? Get creative, dig deep. Do you see anything that's a fixture that's screwed down, nailed down, not easily picked up and walked away with? I see a couple, I guess officially maybe 3 things. They're not the point of this slide. I just sort of pulled that from air. But tell me in the chat, anything here that you see as a fixture? The stuff that's not the main point of the slide, like the floor, the walls, and the baseboard trim. How about that? That trim along the bottom where the floor meets the wall, that came in on a truck and then got nailed to the wall. So it became a fixture, but it started out being personal. In fact, all of it did. Everything in this picture was brought in. And even the flooring, that wood flooring came in sheets, in strips of wood, got fixed and glued maybe down to the floor. And even that wall back there, that sheetrock probably, that came in sheets, got nailed to the studs. We can't see the studs, but they're under there too. All of those things are fixtures. Let's talk about fixtures a little bit. The process of changing real property, like that wall, those floors we just saw, into personal property, that process is called severance. That's probably not too hard to remember. Sever, cutting something off. So maybe think of it like those floors. To me, they might be a glare, but they look sort of like that old pickled oak, which is kind of an 80s kind of a style. Maybe the newest owner is going to look at those and say, you know what, I want to put LVP, luxury vinyl plank floors, not this wood. So let's pull this wood up. So they're going to bust that wood up, and it's going to be piles of debris. It's going to be personal property. They will have severed the fixture, the real property, from it, and turned it back into personal property. We also see it when people cut timber. They cut down trees, or they pick fruit, or they cultivate crops. And that's severance. The opposite of severance is, annexation. That's when we're changing the personal property into real property. You brought the little baby tree from Lowe's and Home Depot. Brought it home. It's in the pot. It's still personal. Throw it in the ground. Take it out of the pot first, as we learned a minute ago. Plant it. Now it's real property. The lumber that made the house came in on the back of a truck. The trusses for the roof came in on the back of a truck. They got installed, added, hammered in place, screwed in, nailed down. They were annexed to become real property. And here's where it all kind of culminates. Okay. Fixtures. That's a big deal, guys. In real life, the day-to-day, the week-to-week, if the buyer and seller, the seller's annoyed at the buyer for maybe coming in with a low offer, or maybe the buyer asked them to fix some things and the seller was kind of offended about that. People have feelings, especially in residential real estate. The emotions come to the surface. They might try to, gosh, I've seen it be so petty as to some people have removed light bulbs before closing. Took every single light bulb out. But it's in the contract. Light bulbs are fixtures. They're supposed to stay. I've seen it where they took off like a foyer table that was actually attached to the wall in the front room, the front foyer, disappeared for the walkthrough before closing. And I had to call the agent and say, we expected that to stay. Not only did they take it down, they left the big gaping holes that were in the wall. If you take something down, you're supposed to repair the holes. TVs, TV mounts, that was a big adjustment in our market. We've gotten it figured out now, and the TV is not the fixture officially, according to the contract that we use. The mounts are, though. The TV mounts are. So if you want to take them with you, they're not cheap either. Some of those moving around mounts that come out from the wall and all that stuff, a seller might want to take them with them, but you need to make sure that it's clearly spelled out who gets what. So attaching things, the process of attaching something to make it a fixture, is that word annexation again. So the process is annexation. The item itself is the fixture. When it comes to fixtures, another acronym for you is IRMA. You can remember it from the hurricane a few years ago. The total circumstances test says what makes something a fixture legally. What was the intention when it was installed? We'll get into that in just a second. What was the relationship of it to the property? What was the method that it was attached to the property with? And how was it adapted to the real estate? So we'll dig into each of those. It's the legal test the courts are going to use if there's a dispute. If the parties sue, somebody sues somebody over it, go to court, the judge is going to say, how does this fixture apply, if it is a fixture, according to the total circumstances test, according to IRMA? In order for it to be deemed a fixture, all four of those have to be, they're all required, but out of all four, the very first one, the I word, intention, is the most important one. So let's look at it. What was the intention when it was put in? Was it intended to stay there forever or not? So the court would say, would a reasonable person have intended for it to stay forever? That's going to go a long way toward the ultimate decision as to whether that thing was a fixture or not. Another one, the next one, is relationship. Who was it that was doing the attaching? Was it the owner of the property? Then it was probably a fixture. It was intended to be one. Or was it the tenant? I helped a girlfriend one time move into her new apartment, and she wanted to install this bracket on the wall that held some decorative plates. She wasn't planning on leaving that behind when she moved out the next year. So that would not probably survive the total circumstances test if the owner and she were in a dispute over her being allowed to take it. When she installed it, it became a fixture as far as how it looked, but it was not intended to stay. The relationship of her to the property, she was just a renter. So therefore, she didn't intend to leave it behind. She's going to take it with her, and she was allowed to. So if it's an owner who's attaching this thing, they usually intend for it to be a permanent attachment and a fixture. So the greater the legal relationship of the person doing the attaching to the real estate, the more likely it's going to be considered a fixture in court. How was it attached? Can it be taken out without a whole bunch of damage? How permanent was it? Was it just welded in place all the way around, super hard to remove? Then that method of annexation would also play a part in the determination. Is it a fixture? How much was the area around it customized? Maybe it was a built-in Sub-Zero refrigerator freezer. Looks like two refrigerators side by side. That's like screwed into the cabinets. You don't just roll that out and unplug it like you can a normal people refrigerator that I have. Those sorts of built-in appliances are customized. The cabinetry is customized around it. And so that method of annexation is part of this total circumstances test. And then finally, the adaptation. Has it been tailored? Has the real estate and the property been tailored to work together? What does not matter when it comes to determining if something is a fixture are these things. I always get to this part, and I always regret that I didn't slow down when I drove by the house. But there's a house on Rocky River Road that was near the next door to the property my dad worked and lived, well, grew up on, and then worked as a mechanic on. And this guy came along, built an acre, or bought an acre next door and built this house. Took him forever. And in the front of that house is a fountain that looks a lot like this. In fact, if you drive by at the normal 45 and just glance, between the house itself and the fountain in front, it kind of looks like a funeral home. But the fountain is enormous. But it doesn't matter. Just looking at this fountain right now, would you assume that it's a fixture or not? It's obviously heavy. To me, just from the bushes around it, I'm assuming it's at least 6-7 feet tall. It's even got water in it. So you're thinking, is it plumbed into a water source? Maybe not. It could just have water in it with a recirculating pump, right? That's just plugged into an outlet nearby. So, okay, good. Okay, good. By the way, if things don't look clear or anything, let me know and I might be able to share it in a way that makes it look better, but I think we're okay. So the size of it, irrelevant as to whether it's a fixture. The value of it doesn't matter, and the location of it. None of those things matter. This fountain could just be sitting on top of the ground, or it could be sitting on top of a concrete pad and bolted and screwed to that concrete pad that's attached to the ground, like through footings or something. Then it would be a fixture, because then you can't just pick it up and walk away with it, even with a forklift, right? It's attached. So that's kind of something to watch out for. Just because it's big and heavy and expensive doesn't mean it's a fixture. All of that to say this: how do we avoid confrontation, disagreement? That's no fun. And we avoid it by putting it in the contract. Just write it up the way the parties intend, right? If the seller wants to take it with them, make sure that they let everyone know, and most importantly, make sure it gets into the contract before closing, like in the beginning with part of the offer. Let's make sure everybody signs off that the seller gets to take the chandelier with them, or whatever it might be. Let me show you that contract itself, if I can find it. There we go. Here's a typical contract that we use. It's called Form 2T. We'll touch on it when we get to it in the course, but we'll go really in depth on it when you take Post 302. But let me just show you something about fixtures in real life. The way fixtures are dealt with in real life, it says here, all existing fixtures are included in the sale as part of the purchase price, free of liens unless excluded. Here's the main thing, unless excluded. We're going to get to that in a minute, but write it in if it's not going to stay or if you want it to stay. So if you ask me in real life, if you came to me and said, Neil, help me with a real estate transaction as a buyer or seller, this IRMA thing is important, but more important is what's in this list. Because if this is the contract we're going to use, these are officially the fixtures. They don't all pass IRMA, but this is in the contract denoted as a fixture. Notice a couple of things here, and I don't want to confuse you. So what I'm about to say will not help you pass the pre-licensing test, but just notice some differences here. Mirrors attached to walls, okay, no problem, but all bathroom wall mirrors. There's no mention of how it's attached. And Joanna Gaines says, take down your old 20-year-old mirror, cut it in smaller and put a frame around it and hang it on the wall like a picture, right? That's sort of the new cool thing to do. It's not even that new anymore. But is that bathroom mirror in the bathroom? Yeah, then it's a fixture. Like in real life, but according to the class, according to IRMA, no. If you could pick it up off of a hook without a screwdriver, in other words, or yanking it out of the wall, then it's not. Then it's not a fixture. But it is because it's on this list in real life. And then this one's always fun: storage, shed, or utility building. Well, what's that? I've been to Lowe's and Home Depot. I've seen plastic structures that were sold as storage sheds and buildings, and you bring it home, you throw it on the patio next to the pool, throw the floats in it. Is it a shed? Is it a building? Well, according to this list, kind of looks like a fixture to me, according to that. But according to IRMA, no, it's not screwed in, nailed down, attached to the real property. So that's how it can get a little different out in the world. And then some other things to note. TVs. The brackets are fixtures. The TVs are not. Even though the TV might be screwed on to the bracket. We ran through the ringer with that. I was there for the whole ride because I've been in this for long enough. And we had to figure out, okay, well, how are we going to do this thing? It happens every time. So don't forget the brackets are like in two pieces. Don't let them take the TV on the truck with the piece of bracket still attached, right? And some other things like the remotes to the fans, because the fan is a fixture, the remote's considered a fixture too. The light bulbs, they do have that covered. Don't steal the light bulbs. And we've got some other, here's my other one that I like to point out. All ranges and ovens. Well, I'm thinking of grandma's house with the old white 20-year-old range with the coily burners, and it's sitting on a wall, no cabinets around it, just all by itself plugged in. And to me, kind of looks the same as the refrigerator does. You could pull them both out from the wall, unplug both, and walk them out the door. But the refrigerator is considered personal property. It's not in this list of fixtures, but the range is considered a fixture. Now, there's some other kind of extenuating circumstances as to why that probably is. For one thing, if you get an FHA loan that we'll learn about later, it's a requirement that the property has a working range in it. So I think that's partly why they just go ahead and put it in as a fixture. All of that to say this: no matter what's in what list, what satisfies IRMA, the parties determine what happens to these things. And so if they do not want something to go along and be appurtenant with the house and convey with the house, then put it in this list. Make sure the buyer knows that they're not going to get that dishwasher when they buy the house because the seller's going to take it with them. The buyer would have had to agree to that before they signed the contract, by the way. But it would need to be in the contract. Even if it was mentioned in the MLS, by the way. Maybe in the MLS, multiple listing service description, it said, hey, the seller just bought the dishwasher and we know it's attached, but they want to take it with them when they leave. Well, if it doesn't make it into this contract as an exception, item that does not convey, like this says right here, they're not taking that dishwasher. And if they do, they are in trouble. they're going to have to replace it or pay for it. Just because they said so on the MLS that's just considered advertising. It would need to make it into the contract. So their listing agent better make sure it gets into the contract, or that listing agent's probably going to be buying them a new dishwasher because they were made to leave it behind. So that's kind of how it translates. And then finally, any personal property, things that can be moved, maybe washer and dryer, clothes washer, dryer, refrigerator. Those frequently are found in this paragraph, just to make sure we know that that's going to be left behind along in the house when it sells and conveys. So write it up. Anything intended not to remain, anything intended to go away. Let's make sure it's in there. Everybody signs off on it. There are always exceptions, and this one is an exception that even has the gall to have the word fixture in it. So it's something called a trade fixture. It applies to commercial real estate, and I always think of a hair salon, but it could be a kitchen, a bar and grill, something with screwed in things. In this case, sinks. Those sinks are plumbed in. You don't just pick them up and walk out the door. You need a wrench, right? So it's officially, by looking at it, a fixture. And in my house, the sink is a fixture. In your house, it's a fixture. But when it comes to a trade fixture in a commercial setting, that means a tenant has rented this place to use for a business that requires this fixture. And she brought in these two sinks, these two stations for the hair salon people, the hairdressers, what do you call them? Stylists, to use. And so when that lease expires, they're going to have the legal right to detach them and take them along with them. So trade fixtures are attached, but they're not considered fixtures. They're considered personal property because they're used in a business. So they're going to go away when the tenant leaves at the end of the lease. So trade fixtures are essentially personal property. And then agricultural fixtures. I always think of these watering devices, but anything that's in that agricultural business, it's not owned by the tenant. It's attached to the rented property. It's used for the business of that agricultural business, and therefore the tenant cannot remove it at the end of the lease. So it's an official fixture that behaves like a fixture because it doesn't get to go away. So agricultural versus trade fixtures. Trade fixtures are personal property. Agricultural ones are real property. Finally, another thing that looks like a fixture but is not. That's a built-in refrigerator. It's screwed into the cabinets, unlike probably all of our refrigerators. And then that's a built-in microwave and oven. You can't just pull those out and pick them up. But they could be personal property if they're financed. That's how they could, this thing that looks like a fixture and normally would be considered one in North Carolina, according to the Uniform Commercial Code, if you bought that refrigerator and oven on credit and haven't paid it in full yet, then what you have is not a fixture. It's personal property until you pay it off. So when you sell a house that has an entire kitchen that's been updated, and maybe they bought matching appliances, but what it turns out they did was finance all of those matching appliances. There's $18,000 worth of matching everything. They didn't pay for that in cash. They financed it, got a Lowe's card. They're going to have to settle that up before they can sell the property, or at closing, they're going to have to pay it off in full because those things would otherwise need to come out of there. So a financed fixture is considered personal property because it's not paid off. Oh, yeah, thank you. Appreciate you covering for me there in the chat. Teamwork. Couple more terms. Improved land. Improved land is something that has a structure on it. Like this piece of dirt with this barn on it, that's improved land. Compare that to the term improved lot. That just means it has basic services available. Water, sewer, power, phone, street access. things that you see when you drive through a new construction neighborhood that's still in construction. Those are improved lots. They've been improved. They're not just dirt. But improved land means it's land with a structure on it. So with that said, is it always easy to tell what a fixture is? No, it can be a mystery. Definitely. You just need to make sure that the parties agree in writing what's going to happen to this thing. All right. What am I looking at here? What do we have here? Manufactured home, mobile home. I'm glad you said that, because modular home is a different thing. We're going to get to that in a second. But before we talk about the modular, let's talk about this one. This is different. The thing that's different about it, if you notice the little red animations, that's a hitch on the front that's installed on the chassis, just like a trailer. It's literally a trailer home. That was the original word for it, right? Then they got sexy and tried to call it something to make it more marketable, called it a mobile home or a manufactured home. But it's got its own wheels. It's got its own axle. It's got its own hitch. And therefore, when you roll it onto the lot that you bought, you're going to live in it on this acreage that you bought, it's still considered personal property, while it still has the hitch and the wheels and the axle. So one step to convert this mobile home from personal into real property involves removing those things that make it portable. Right now, somebody could just back a truck up to it, hitch it up, and drive away. But think about this. Does a mortgage lender want to loan money to someone to buy this and use it as a home while it's still portable? No. They want it to be real property, immovable, right? Not portable. Therefore, the 3 steps to make a mobile home real property remove the things that make it portable: hitch, wheels, axle. Then attach it to a permanent foundation. They're going to need to build up. This is probably like in a mobile home park, which is rented land in the mobile home itself. So, but if they were on dirt that they owned, they're going to need to build probably like a brick foundation, for instance, something attached to the ground, and then bolt that mobile home down to that foundation after they take off the hitch and the wheels and the axle. So then the third thing, remove the hitch and wheels, attach it to a permanent foundation. Then number 3, contact the Department of Motor Vehicles, because this thing had to ride on the road. It legally was a trailer to get to the location. And so the DMV cared about it. It cared that it was safe to be traveling across the road with its own wheels. So we need to let the DMV know, look, this is no longer movable, portable. This is now real property. File an affidavit with the DMV confirming that you did those other things. If you don't do this step, it's not yet legally considered real property. And I've had this slow down a closing before. I listed a house and a guy came along, called me on the yard sign, wanted to buy my listing. In order to buy my listing, he needed to come up with a down payment. And he owned a mobile home, free and clear. So what he wanted to do was get something called a home equity line of credit against his mobile home. That means that the bank would let you pledge that property as collateral and then get a chunk of money and basically take the equity out of the home. So maybe that mobile home's worth $100,000. The bank might let you take out $80,000 loan against the mobile home, a home equity line of credit. He wanted to do that in order to use it as a down payment for buying my listing. But come to find out, when he bought that mobile home, he brought it onto the lot. He removed the hitch and wheels. He put it on a foundation, but he never filed the affidavit with the DMV. It ended up taking him a month to do that. And so I was the only agent involved. I had to call my seller and say, oh, so this happened. He can't get his home equity line of credit for his down payment until he files the affidavit with the DMV for the property that he's going to use to get that equity line. And this was like 3 years ago, 20 years into the business. You just never know what's going to happen. New things all the time. So that's what turns this mobile home from personal property into real property. Those three things. Remove the stuff, attach it to a permanent foundation, file it with the DMV. That mobile home, by the way, was made probably in a factory, right? Climate controlled, systematized building method. They probably had a team that built the walls and another team that put in the plumbing and the electrical. And they put it piece by piece, and it was pretty quick. Probably went together pretty fast, pretty efficiently. Another thing that gets built in factories is a modular home. But this is not the same thing. The main difference is the modular never had its own wheels, right? It was never officially a trailer. It rode on the back of a trailer, like a semi-truck trailer, in pieces, big chunks. Like this is probably one chunk. It's riding on the back of a truck, and once they get it out to the property, they're going to crane it off of the truck and set it in place. But it never has its own axle, wheels, hitch. And therefore, the DMV doesn't care about it. They don't need to be involved. You don't need to file an affidavit with a modular home. Side note, when it comes to valuation of real estate properties, modular homes are told, appraisers who need to do appraisals on property, they are told that, hey, modular homes have the same value as a stick-built home. Even though it was brought on the back of a truck, put into place in big 3 or 4 chunks, it is still valued the same. However, a mobile home just is not. Historically, they don't hold value like real other types of properties do. But modulars do better at that. They are factory built, climate controlled, probably. State building codes are required. They also have to survive the drive across the road. So case could be made that they're built just as well or better than a on-site stick-built home. And they're governed by North Carolina general statute, these building codes that they have to be built by. So, okay, it's the next one. So that modular home, the question is, when does it become real property? It rode on the back of the truck in probably 2 or 3 pieces, but it becomes real property when you assemble it on the site. Not needing to file an affidavit with the DMV, just put it together on the site. Now it's considered real property. And so it kind of looks like this. They brought it in pieces on the truck. They have that permanent foundation in place. They have a crane. And I wish it could go this fast, but it's still pretty fast. And they just put that thing together. It might be done in a couple of days because they're going to need to put those pieces together and then fill in any other siding or stuff that might have gotten blown off, or they didn't want to worry about it getting blown off during transit. So at this point at which this is finally completely assembled on the site there, now that modular home is considered real property. So as a broker going maybe to go list a property for sale, you see a mobile home on that, maybe in the backyard, there's a regular house and there's a mobile off to the side. What do you need to ask if you see that mobile home on a property? You got it. Is it real property, essentially? Is it real or is it personal? Has it been registered with the DMV, that affidavit filed? And yeah, all those things are right. Did they remove the hitch and the wheels? Did they attach it to a permanent foundation? And then did they register it, file the affidavit with the DMV? Okay, that's modular versus mobile. And that's what you need to know about those things. Now we get into the first little sometimes point of confusion. We're going to talk about estates in real property. Perfect break time. So I'll see you in 10. Welcome back. Let's pick it up. We left off right about here. Okay, this concept of estates in real property, we're not talking about big fancy properties. Doesn't have anything to do with the price range of some big, huge monster house in 28 acres or anything. We're just talking about the definition of ownership. What can you do with it? So the degree, quantity, and extent of your ownership interest in the property, your present rights of possessing it, your future rights of possessing it. What are you allowed to do with it? It's not a property description. It's the description of the rights themselves. So estates in real property have to do with the rights that you have in it, not the size or the value of the property itself. There's two types of estates. There's the estate where you own it and the estate where you don't own it, but you get to use it. Rentals, right? So when you own it, that's called freehold ownership. A freehold estate is the type of estate that you have when you own a property. A non-freehold or leasehold estate is the type of estate what you can do with it when you're just a renter. So for you guys who are renting property, there's both of these in place. There's a freehold estate in place for the landlord, the one that you rent from, in terms of their ownership of the property. And there's a non-freehold estate in place for you who are renting the property from them, right? So it's both. But my property here that I live in, there's no rentals going on. I don't rent it to anybody. I just own it. So it's just freehold. So we're going to focus on the freehold side tonight. And then in a future chapter, 2 chapters, in fact, down the road, a few weeks, we're going to get into leases and learn a little bit about leases. But primarily in this class, it's all about ownership. And here's the overarching big sort of graphic of what freehold estates look like. So let me break that down a little bit. Let's just look at it this way. And by the way, when it comes to reviewing and studying this thing, get to the point where you can draw this yourself, right? Be able to just see this in your mind and draw this out. And I think it will help you on test questions. So these are all of the freehold types of estates. All the types of ownership, of owning something. And the two biggest categories, the two categories under this freehold is whether or not you can leave it to your heirs. That's what inheritable means. Inheritable, can it be inherited? There are 3 types of inheritable estates. 3 types of estates that you can leave to your heirs. The best possible kind of ownership is this one called fee simple absolute. That word absolute means you have absolute control over it. You can do whatever you want to with it. No, the previous owner that you bought it from has no say-so in what you're allowed to do with it. That's how this is different from these other ones. The person you bought it from can't tell you what to do with it when it's fee simple absolute. But if it's not fee simple absolute, if it's one of these other kinds like this one, fee simple defeasible, then the person you buy it from actually can give you a condition that you must follow. If you want to buy it, then you have to follow their instructions. That's what fee simple defeasible means. What happens if you don't follow their instructions? You lose the property. It goes away. That's part of the deal. If you buy a property as a fee simple defeasible, then you could lose it. And so I like to remember that by thinking of the word defeasible as the word defeatable. Your ownership can be defeated if you don't do it right. If you do something you're not supposed to, if you use it in a way you're not allowed to, or if you don't keep using it in a certain way. So let's look at this fee simple defeasible concept. There's two kinds. One kind says you must keep using it in a certain way. And that one is called fee simple defeasible determinable. You might see it referenced as that whole one big four-word phrase, or you might just see it called that one word determinable. But it's a type of fee simple defeasible. Determinable is a type of fee simple defeasible. What does that mean? Determinable, I can't make any sense of it, but what it means is you must keep using it in a certain way. Like what? Like you must always use it as a farm. So an example might be always a farm. Or maybe it's a church, and so you must always use it for the church. You got to keep using it that way. Or maybe always natural area. You can't develop it. Must always use it as a natural area. Any of those things, meaning the owner that you buy it from, the seller you buy it from, could possibly sell it to you in this way. What if you don't want to follow these rules? Then you're not going to buy that property, right? If they're not willing to sell it to you other than this fee simple defeasible determinable way. If you don't want to play by their rules, then maybe you could talk them into selling it to you as fee simple absolute, or maybe you're just going to need to keep shopping. Go find something else, because this property owner who's selling it has conditions attached, and that's what these things are. It could be fee simple defeasible in a different way too. Here's another one that's also fee simple defeasible. It's called fee simple defeasible. You're going to love this one. Subject to a condition not done subsequent. Let's all pause and roll our eyes at the legal terms that we have to learn for this class. It's like, really, why? Can't we just make it easy? Fee simple defeasible subject to a condition subsequent. I just think of it as the longer one, right? So what's the longer one say? The shorter one said you must keep using it a certain way. The longer one says you must not use it in a certain way. Not allowed to do something with it. Like what? Never use it to serve alcohol. It can never be a bar, or it can never be a restaurant that serves alcohol. Maybe never subdivide it, never develop it. Can only be, if it's a 10-acre parcel, you can only ever use it as a 10-acre parcel. You can't chop it up. Whatever. The key word here is not. You're not allowed to do something with it in particular. That's the difference between these two kinds of fee simple defeasible. Determinable or subject to. Determinable means you must keep on using it a certain way. Subject to means you must not use it in a certain way. So we're going to dig into those a little more thoroughly. Then there's two other kinds of things we'll get into that are both types of life estates. And I'm going to make a little different color on this one because one of them is called an estate for the life of another. And that means that your ownership of it is for an amount of time. It's for a lifespan of someone. It's not a condition like either keep using it or don't use it. It's for literally somebody's life while they're alive is how long you get to own it. That's what a life estate is. This is a type of life estate. Another type of life estate falls under the category of non-inheritable, and that's called a conventional life estate. So it's the same color because these are both kinds of life estates. What's the difference? We'll get into that more in a minute. Let's go ahead and finish out this concept of fee simple defeasible. Let's flip back to the slides on that. So, of course, first of all, fee simple absolute, that's the best way. The previous owner, the buyer, the seller you're buying from is not giving you conditions. You don't owe them anything. You don't have to behave according to any sort of way that they're requiring. It's the best way you could own a property. No limitations, no conditions. They're selling it to you, and it's your business to do with it as you please. Not to say that you can do just anything with it, because there are other entities that can tell you what to do with it, like the zoning board. According to what type of zoning the property has, you may not be able to operate a business out of it. You've got to use it for residential or vice versa. But this is all about what is the seller you're buying it from telling you you're allowed to do with it. Fee simple absolute means they're not telling you anything that you're allowed to do with it. It's none of your, they don't care. Here you go, here's your property, just give me the money and you go do you. But fee simple defeasible is the thing that says when that person you buy it from gives you conditions within which you have to behave with this property or use this property. Fee simple defeasible determinable says you must keep using it in a certain way, like for a church. Fee simple defeasible subject to a condition subsequent says you must never use the property in a certain way, like it must never be used to serve alcohol. That's starting to make sense? This is about what the person you're buying it from tells you you can do with it. And if you want to buy this property, you're going to have to go along with what they say. Your other choice is don't buy this one if you don't like the fact that it comes with these conditions. While we're on that, I don't want to, let's continue the theme here of fee simple defeasible. That fee simple determinable, the one says that you must keep using it in a certain way. Well, you're probably all thinking it. Okay, make me. How are you going to make me do it? Well, if the condition is violated, fee simple defeasible determinable must keep using it in a certain way. If you stop using it in a certain way, if you start using it a different way, then your ownership of it automatically reverts back to the seller. Now you're about to ask, how does that work? And the answer I can give you is, doesn't matter for this class. In real life, we're going to seek advice from an attorney. So we don't have to go that deep. This is the furthest we need to go with this in class. Just know that it automatically reverts back to the seller if you violate the condition under fee simple determinable. The other one, condition subsequent, that says you must not use it in a certain way, it does not have automatic reversion back to the owner. If you do, it says must not use it to sell alcohol, but you start selling alcohol, then the seller would have to pursue you in court to get their ownership back. That's all you need to know about it. And in real life, as a broker, you would never even give opinions of this anyway. You'd say, okay, you're at the point, Mr. Client, that you need to talk to an attorney about this. You started selling alcohol on it. The seller found out. They're taking you to court over it. I can help you sell the property. I can help you with the real estate, but I can't give you legal advice. Here's a good attorney to talk to. So this is all you need to know. For C, fee simple, defeasible, determinable, must keep using it in a certain way and automatically reverts back if you stop using it that certain way, if you change to another way. And then condition subsequent, you must not use it a certain way. No automatic reversion. The seller would have to find out about it and then pursue you in court over it. That is all fee simple, defeasible. So the test question, I've seen practice questions that give you this. They say the seller sold it to this buyer, and this buyer was required to never sell alcohol on the property. What is this called? And the answer choices might be fee simple, defeasible, fee simple, absolute, or fee simple, condition subsequent. There would be 4 choices. But out of that list, defeasible is true. It's a type of defeasible, but the better answer is fee simple, defeasible, condition subsequent. You see that test taking skill, you're looking for the best possible answer. So while defeasible would be a true statement, they also gave you the answer choice of condition subsequent. Therefore, that's the best answer. So you need to know that there are 2 kinds of fee simple, defeasible, this one and this one. Now, the life estates. One type of life estate, let's do this one first. The conventional life estate. Remember, it's the one right here. It's a non-inheritable kind of ownership, meaning if you have a conventional life estate, if you own property as a conventional life estate, you cannot leave it to your heirs. It's impossible to leave it to your heirs. Why is that? Because there are some, let me get rid of all this. Let's look at this. Let's keep it simple. We've got our freehold estates, which means ownership. We've got our inheritable kind. And our non-inheritable kind. And then we've got a conventional life estate. Let's talk about that one first. There are some terms you need to know. The person who gets this life estate, this conventional life estate from the seller, they either buy it from them or they get it from them, that person is called the life tenant. Don't worry about the fact that you think tenant means renter. We're using tenant in a different way here. The life tenant is the one who owns it. They own that conventional life estate. That means they get to use it. They get to do all the things someone who owns something can do. But what do they own? They don't own it fee simple absolute. That would mean there's no conditions. They own it as a conventional life estate. What are the conditions involved in a life estate? Your ownership is only for the lifetime of someone. And then that person whose lifetime that your ownership depends on is called the measuring life. The measuring life. You own it for as long as that person is alive. When it's a conventional life estate, it's the same person. The life tenant is the same person as that measuring life. You get to own it for as long as you live. I know. Pause for you to roll your eyes and think, this is stupid. Who would ever do this? It happens sometimes when it's like, let's let that little old lady still live there until she dies because she's 98. and we'll just let her own it with a life estate. And she gets to own it while she's living. And then once she's no longer alive, it goes somewhere else to some other ownership. So it's used in that way sometimes. But the thing about a conventional life estate is the person who owns that conventional life estate gets to use it as they're the owner, but only as long as they are alive. So the life tenant and the measuring life people are the same person when it's a conventional. That means if this life tenant dies, but they leave it in their will that it goes to their kids, the will doesn't matter because what they own is a conventional life estate. Therefore, sorry, you wrote it up in the will. It was a waste of time and money. It's going to not go to your kids. It can't. It's non-inheritable. It cannot be inherited because it's only good as long as you are alive. You with me? With that said, where can it go? If you die, if the measuring life dies, what are the options for where it goes? So what happens at death? One of two things. And guess who decides what happens to it when you die? Any guesses in the chat? I just saw the chat. Any guesses as to who decides what? Yeah, you got it. The seller. Not even you. You don't even get to decide that. You're the life tenant and the measuring life, but the one who sold it to you gets to decide what happens when you die to the property. It's either going to revert back to them, and if they're dead, that would mean it reverts to their estate. Or if they don't want to do that, it could go to someone called a remainderman. That's a third party. Anybody. It could also be a charity. Maybe the seller says, you know what, I don't have any kids myself, and I'll probably be dead by the time this life tenant measuring life person dies. So I'm not going to have it revert back to me or my estate. I'm just going to let it go to the Boys and Girls Club of North Carolina. And they can sell it, keep the money, whatever they want to do. So that remainderman option is just a third party. It could be a person, it could be an entity, it could be a charity, someone other than the seller themselves. But no matter what, when that life tenant who is also the measuring life dies, what we know it's not going to go to is their heirs because it's, again, non-inheritable. They can't leave it to their heirs because it's not inheritable because it's only theirs as long as they live. Now, that is a conventional life estate. That's not inheritable. Let's look at this other one. The one under the inheritable column is something called, it's a weird French word, an estate, and I never took French. Pour haute vie, apparently, is how you're supposed to say that, sort of. I said pour autre vie, and a French person laughed at me. But it means for the life of another. Oh, well, there's a hint. It's another kind of life estate. But guess what? The life tenant who gets to own it is not the same thing as the measuring life, not the same person. It's for the life of another. So, in this case, with an estate for the life of another or an estate pour haute vie, you've got this little person over here, this life tenant, and then this little person over here is the measuring life. And as long as this measuring life person is alive, this life tenant gets to own it. But when this measuring life person dies, this life tenant doesn't get to own it anymore. Okay? You figured that out just by the name. But let's think about this possibility. What if the measuring life person is more healthy than the life tenant, and it's actually the life tenant who dies first? And that life tenant person left a will, and in that will they had some heirs, and they left it to their heirs. Guess what? Whose lifespan does this ownership depend upon? The measuring life, who is still alive. So this life tenant person who dies gets to leave it to their heirs. That's what makes it inheritable. That's why an estate for the life of another is actually an inheritable estate. So maybe these kids that they left it to, they're sad that their dad died, but they're happy that they get this 100-acre property until they ask an attorney, what is this thing called a pour aut vie? And the attorney explains, well, see, you don't own this forever. You own this as long as this person is alive. But when they die, you don't own it anymore. Maybe those kids who just inherited this thing aren't quite as excited about having this new chunk of land or whatever it is, property, house, whatever it might be. That's the big difference between an estate for the life of another and a conventional life estate. Now, the next part is what happens once that measuring life dies? Same thing as what happens in a conventional life estate. It was determined by the seller. It's either going to revert to the seller or it's going to go to a third-party remainderman. That's not different. Same stuff. You could also, by the way, see this. Let's do it this way. You might see the word reversionary. So don't let that throw you. It's either going to say reverts or reversionary interest, something like that. That just means it goes back to the seller. But does that make sense how for the life of another kind could actually be inheritable? It's if the life tenant person dies before the measuring life does. And then whoever they have lined up for things to go to upon their death gets to own it. So which leads me to the other thing. What can you do with a life estate? It's not a great deal. It's not as good as the fee simple absolute. But what can you do with it? You can do all the things you normally can, as long as the people that you do them with are aware. Like, for instance, could you rent out a life estate? Could you rent it to someone? Sure. As long as the person you rent it to understands that it could go away when that measuring life person goes away, when the measuring life dies, whichever type it is, whether it's conventional or for the life of another, measuring life goes away, that tenant no longer gets to rent it because it's a life estate. Yes, sir. That's right. That's right. That's the big difference. And that's why it's not inheritable. Because the minute that measuring life dies, the life tenant has died. The minute the measuring life dies, the life tenant has died too, yes, but they also are the one that no longer gets to use it, right? So they can't leave it to anybody. Because when the measuring life dies, it's either going to go revert back to the seller or go to a third party. Yes, that's the other good point. Good point. Seller lines all this up. The seller has chosen to sell it to this life tenant with these conditions in place. You bet. And the seller determines what happens when that measuring life dies at the end, no matter which it is. I've never run across it in practice. Never had one, but I've heard of it. And again, I've heard of it when some elderly person somebody wants to give them the ability to just not be moving out, not have to move them out of a place they were in for 40 years or 80 years or something. Let's just let them live out their days in this place as the owner. Then when they're dead, it reverts to another or goes to a remainderman. Another kind, now this is not life estates anymore. Well, yeah, it is kind of. But another kind of non-inheritable estate is called marital life estate. And what that is, there's not like a remainderman or a life tenant. There's none of that. But it has to do with the fact that a spouse maybe tries to either leave their spouse out of the will or has no will. And in that case, because they were married, the surviving spouse is entitled to a certain percentage of ownership based on how many years they were married. So that's just a little difference there. It kind of goes back to how in North Carolina, spouses they have this, you can't sell a property without your spouse knowing. In other words, that's another thing. But there's actually a chart. You don't need to know it for this class, so I don't share it with you, but you could Google search for North Carolina marital life estate chart, and it would show you how many years you are married, gets you how much of a percentage of ownership in your deceased spouse's real estate when they die. And that applies, again, if they're trying to either leave them out of the will or if there is no will. They still have a certain minimum percentage of ownership interest just because they were married for a certain number of years. And that's all this thing called marital life estate. So let's look at it a little more pretty. Might make it easier. Okay, conventional life estate. To recap, not inheritable because the life tenant is the same as the measuring life. Therefore, you can't leave it to your heirs. This means the seller has imposed a limitation, right? The limitation here compared to the fee simple defeasible is that this is about a lifespan. Fee simple defeasible is about a condition of use, right? The condition is based on their usage. This is based on someone's lifespan. So the buyer gets the property for only as long as they themselves are alive, because the life tenant in a conventional life estate is the measuring life. And when that measuring life dies, what happens to the property depends on the wishes of the original seller. Either reverts back to them or their estate, or it goes to a third party, quite often a charity. That is the one that is not inheritable. But the one that is inheritable is this one, for the life of another, pour out v. The seller imposed this limitation. Buyer gets to use it, own it, as long as someone else is alive. So that measuring life is a different person from the life tenant. And when that measuring life does die, again, either reverts back or goes to a remainderman. But if it's the life tenant who dies first, it's going to go to whoever the life tenant has set up to leave the property to. For both conventional life estate and pour out v life estate, what can the grantee of that estate, the one receiving it, or the buyer, do with the property? They can sell it, by the way, too. They could sell their interest. It's just they have to sell it to somebody that understands I'm buying something that could go away from me too. It's only going to be mine as long as this measuring life is alive. How hard is it going to be to find a buyer? Probably a lot harder than a fee simple absolute kind, right? They could also mortgage it. They could borrow against the property if they can find a bank willing to loan it to them, knowing that it's a life estate. Again, might be kind of hard. They could rent it. They could also use just enough wood on the property, timber on the property for fuel and to make repairs. But they can't clear cut it because, again, their ownership is limited. Therefore, they can't just cut all the trees off of it. And only for as much as it takes to provide it as fuel, firewood, for instance, and make repairs. But if they can find a willing party to do any of these things, they can do it. But it's only going to last even for that person that they're renting to or selling to, as long as that measuring life is alive. For the conventional life estate, again, they can make ordinary repairs, maintain it. They can't waste it. They do have to pay the property taxes, and they have to pay interest on the original owner's mortgage. They cannot sell the wood and timber, like all of it, on the property. They can't waste it, and they can't leave it to others because it's a conventional life estate. Never. I've never seen these. Someone said, how often? I don't see it very often, but it's just one of those things. It exists. So someone says, what happens when the seller and the life tenant die? Well, that's a good question. If it's a conventional life estate and the life tenant dies, then it's either going to revert back to the seller or go to a remainderman. And if the seller has died and it was set up to revert back to them, then it's going to go to their heirs. Right? If it's an estate for the life of another and the life tenant dies, it's going to go to that life tenant's heirs for as long as the measuring life is still alive. Then when the measuring life dies, if it's set up to revert back to the original seller, but the seller's dead, then again, it goes to their heirs. In real life, you'll be relieved to know, as I've already said, that we don't even have to worry about it. If we run into this, we just pass them on to an attorney. That attorney is who's authorized and capable of handling this stuff. We don't need to be the expert. That's legal stuff. Here's the marital life estate. It means a spouse can't cut out another spouse completely. If they've either left no will or tries to cut them out of the will, that surviving spouse still has a certain percentage of ownership that they're entitled to based on how long they were married. But that's all you need to know. You don't need to know details. You don't need to know the chart, how many percentage points or anything like that. Point is that the spouse has rights even if they're not mentioned in the deed, by the way. If you're married to someone and they're on the deed but you're not, you still have rights. Good question. Does this rule supersede a prenuptial? I would refer to an attorney, but I would dare say depends on how that prenup is written, probably, right? But thankfully we don't have to make that call. I'd check with an attorney. So a deed that includes a condition requiring something of the owner is called what? What kind of deed requires something of the owner? Let's just leave it at that. Requires something of the owner, gives the owner a condition. What kind of deed might that be? Fee simple what? You got it. Fee simple defeasible. You could have also said fee simple determinable or fee simple subject to a condition subsequent, but they are both types of fee simple defeasible, and all we asked about was a condition. We didn't say what that condition was. So good job. Let's look at this one. Michael agrees to buy a property from Dwight. During the title search, the attorney sees that Michael is limited to only using the property as a farm. What type of freehold estate does Michael have? Well done. Must keep using it as a farm, in other words. And you all noticed that fee simple defeasible was an answer choice, but you didn't pick it because we had a better choice, fee simple determinable, more specifically that. But if determinable weren't an answer choice, it was just B, C, or D, then fee simple defeasible would have been the only, right? but determinable is the better choice here. Chandler agreed to purchase a property from Phoebe. The closing attorney discovered that Chandler could never use the property as a business serving alcohol. What type of estate? Oops, I need to swap a name. What type of estate does Chandler have? And that's what they like to do, throw a bunch of same letter words at you. So conditional, not quite right. Consequential, not at all. Condition servient, no, there's both of those words that show up in this course, but not together. Fee simple, condition subsequent. C. Well done. Stanley goes under contract to purchase a property from Meredith. During the title search, the closing attorney discovers that, Stanley's use of the property has no limitations on use. What type of deed does Stanley have? I need to fix names on that too. No limitations. Best possible kind of ownership is fee simple absolute. Well done. Ron Swanson agrees to sell his land to Andy and April. The attorney discovers during their title search that Andy's and April's use of the property had a limitation. What type of deed do they have? Had a limitation. And there's another case where there's 3 possible answers, but the best answer, since it has a limitation, is defeasible. There's 2 kinds of defeasible also mentioned here, but the best answer choice here would be D. Absolute would mean no limitations at all. So a property owner wants to transfer their property to another and then have it returned to them. Which option should they put in place, a reversionary interest or a remainderman? They want it to revert back, don't they? So that's reversionary. Well done. Okay, let's see. Oh, good. Came right up. All right. Now, let's talk about how many owners we could be dealing with. We've been talking about fee simple. Fee simple, freehold estates. Now, let's talk about what it's called when one person owns a property. One owner. The word for one owner, I'm sorry to say, is severalty. Ownership in severalty. And you're thinking, that's the dumbest name ever. Several means multiple people. But you have to think of it like sever. Like, chopping something off, severing. There's that one thing left. So severalty means one entity or one person owns the thing. But what we're going to spend the more time on is concurrent ownership, more than one person or entity owning a property. That's easier because in Spanish, con means with. That's how I remember it. So concurrent ownership, more than one person or entity. When you own something with another person, you can't just draw the line down the center and you stay on that side of the condo and I'll stay on this side. Oops, sorry, your side doesn't have the kitchen on it. Too bad for you. But my side doesn't have the bathroom on it. Too bad for me. No, it has this thing called unity of possession, meaning no separate sections. Each person has full access to the whole property, even though they own it maybe 50-50. So concurrent ownership involves unity of possession. There are 3 kinds of concurrent ownership, 3 ways that you could own property with someone else. Tenants in common is in fact the most common way that people own property together. Joint tenancy is a little more tricky. We'll see what that means in a minute. But then tenancy by the entirety is exclusive to married people. Spouses only. If you're married, then you can own something as tenants by the entirety. But if you're not married, that's not available to you. Tenants by the entirety is only for married people. Write that one down. Let's talk about it first because it makes sense. If you're married and a spouse dies, what happens to the property? The surviving spouse gets all of it. So they become an owner in severalty, don't they? They become the only owner. It's this thing called right of survivorship. That's what's built into tenancy by the entirety for married folks. The ability for the surviving spouse, surviving owner to have all of it. Now they own the 100%. What else is true for tenancy by the entirety is that both spouses must sign in order to sell it. You can't sell your property as a secret from your spouse. You could buy it by yourself without them knowing if you could pay cash. But once you go to sell it, they're going to have to sign off. They're going to have to sign the deed. And then what you also cannot do as tenants by the entirety is you're owning it with your spouse. You can't force them to sell it because you want to cash out. That would be called right to partition. There's no right to partition it. You can't say, well, I want my money out of this. I'm going to sue you and force you to sell it so that I can get my part out of this. Not allowed, not included. It's not a part of tenancy by the entirety. It is a part of the other two that we just looked at that we're going to study in a minute. So the right to partition, you could, if you own something with someone else as tenants in common or as joint tenants, you could sue your co-owners for right to partition. You could make them sell it in order to get your piece out of it if you won that suit. And then tenancy by the entirety is the favorite, the most predominant way that married people own property in North Carolina. You don't have to, though. Just because you're married doesn't mean you're required to own it as tenants by the entirety. But it tends to be the way that people are going to. And if you tell an attorney, me and my spouse are going to buy this property, then unless you tell them otherwise, they're probably going to write it up as tenancy by the entirety. They're going to write the deed that way, unless you tell them otherwise, because that's normally the way it's done. But again, you and your spouse could own it any of these three ways, not just this way. We'll talk about why you might choose another way in a minute. So therefore, tenancy by the entirety is what's automatically going to happen. The attorney's going to write the deed up that way unless you tell them otherwise. What happens if a single person buys property and then gets married later? How do they own it? They bought it while single. They bought it and it was called at that time ownership in severalty because it was just them by themselves. But then they get married. It does not automatically change over to tenancy by the entirety. Their ownership will not automatically become that. There's no magic ink that reforms the words into tenancy by the entirety, right? If they're both on the deed, you could add them to the deed. They'd be considered tenants in common. You could have the deed rewritten as tenants by the entirety, but it doesn't happen automatically. And then when they sell, again, both of them have to sign the deed. It's not enough for only one of them to sign the deed. That kind of falls under this marital rights thing, making sure both parties actually want to do this thing. How does this tenancy by the entirety end? How can it end? Could end because of death. Because one spouse dies, now it's no longer tenants by the entirety. It's ownership in severalty, only one owner, the surviving spouse. It could also end through legal agreement. Hey, let's just go back to the attorney and say we want to rewrite this thing. No longer as tenancy by the entirety. We want to be maybe tenants in common together. We're still married. We're not getting divorced. We just want to own it differently for some reason or another. So we're no longer owning it as tenants by the entirety. We want to own it as tenants in common. And it could also end because of divorce. In the process of that divorce, someone maybe buys the other one out. One gets the house. The other decides that's cool too, and they sign off saying so. But here's where it matters to us as brokers out in the field. Sometimes you'll go on a listing appointment and that person will say, oh, well, we're divorced. I'm the only owner. And you're like, Okay, great. That's easy. I just need your signature. Not great that you're divorced, but just need the one signature. And then they'll move on. Let me just say it in the form of an example, firsthand example. I agreeably ended a relationship many, many years ago. We parted as friends. And so like 10 years after that, she called out of the blue. And in the meantime, since we split up, I think she married a guy. They had a kid. No, they didn't get married. That's the whole point of the story. They got together. She had a kid. They never got married. They decided to part ways, but because of the kid, they stayed amicable and friendly, and they co-parented the child. She called me, said, I own this property. Are you still in real estate? Can you list it for me? And so I did. And I went there and I said, oh, wow, okay. We caught up. She told me about the kids. She told me about the father of the kid. And I said, well, so, sorry, I'm mixing up my story. They did get married. That's what it was. They were married. She said, don't worry about it. We're divorced. And I said, okay, so then I just need your signature. And she went on to say, well, we're practically divorced. We haven't officially finished the divorce, but we've been separated for like 9 years. We just haven't ever gotten around to it. And I'm like, okay, now we have a problem. Now we need his signature too. And she said, oh, well, okay, no big deal. He'll do whatever I say. I'm like, okay, well, I'll believe that when I see it. But he actually did. Everybody signed off on it. It all worked out okay. But they were still separated after all these years. And I had to say, look, that's not good enough for our purposes. I need his signature on everything too. He had to sign the listing agreement. And then when we got it sold, he had to sign the contract, right, as well. And thankfully he did. But mostly in those situations, the spouses are still not too thrilled with each other. And sometimes they're harder to get signatures with. So a legal separation agreement's not enough to change that form of ownership. You would need to see proof that they were divorced so you know who you're dealing with. We come back from break, we'll talk about tenants in common. I'll see you in 10. Welcome back. Okay, we left off talking about tenants by the entirety. That's how married people own things. However, another choice is this one, tenants in common. And that's available to anybody, married or otherwise. Tenancy in common or tenants in common, ownership as tenants in common, is the most common kind of ownership, much more so than joint tenancy. But again, married people could choose it as well. The thing that's so good about tenancy in common is it's a little more flexible than joint tenancy. It allows for uneven ownership, unequal. You could, these three gentlemen here could own it as, for instance, 50%, 20, and 30. One of them 50%, one of them 20%, one of them 30% ownership. So that's available, unequal ownership interests. You could also leave it to your heirs or sell your piece without your co-owner's consent. You could just choose to do this, and it's not up to them. It's not for them to allow. They could show up one day and find out that you had sold your part of it, your part to someone else or multiple people. Maybe you're the 50% person and you sell 30% to somebody and 20% to someone else, and you're out of there. That's allowed. You could also choose to encumber or attach a lien or a mortgage against your portion, your part of the ownership. You own, let's say, 70%. You could mortgage your 70%. And those other two guys own maybe 10 and 5% each. Sorry, that doesn't add up. 20 and 10% each. Then you could just encumber by a mortgage or a lien as you see fit. And tenancy in common allows for acquisition at different times. You could buy it together with somebody, like these three guys buy it together, and then next year one of them sells his part to two other people, and everybody is still considered a tenant in common. That's not the same thing that happens when it's a joint tenant situation. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then there's also that right to partition or right of partition. So you could force your co-owners to sell so that you could get your financial piece out of it. That is tenancy in common. It's inheritable, right? You can leave it to your heirs if you want to. So you've got Pam and Jim. Pam owns 33%, Jim owns 27%, and Toby is the third owner. Toby's got 40%, but he sells his piece. Toby sells his 40% to Creed and Phyllis for 25% to her, 15% to him. So now it's four owners, all with different percentages of ownership. That's allowed in tenancy in common. Anybody, any owner can sell or will their part without the other partner's permission. And then this can force each other to sell through right to partition. All of that makes a little more sense when you compare it to the other choice. The other way to own something, the third way, is joint tenancy. If you own something with other folks as joint tenants, one big advantage of joint tenancy is something that it has in common with tenants by the entirety, and that is right of survivorship. Joint tenancy includes that feature. That means if you own a property with a couple other people and you die, then it's not your heirs that's going to get it, that's going to get your part. Since you're a joint tenant, it's those other two owners that are going to own it now. So what was a 33% each ownership amount, because you own it equally, became a 50-50. When you died, the surviving members, got the ownership through right of survivorship. Joint tenancy might be useful to somebody who is in a relationship but doesn't want to get married, but still wants the right of survivorship feature, right? So think of it that way. Don't want to get married to this person, but I do want to own property with them, and let's do it as joint tenancy, because it might be this situation. Maybe it's a long-term relationship and you both have had kids from other spouses and the kids are all grown. You got kids, they have kids, and they're grown up and they're fine. They don't need any help from you. They have their own houses, their own stuff. So you're not worried about taking care of them. And you get together, you have this relationship with this person, and you guys decide to go buy a condo at the beach together. And you do it as joint tenants, because when one of you dies, you want it set up so that the other one of you gets all of it. You're not worried about your half going to your kids. You see, right? So the type of ownership, whether it's tenants in common or joint tenancy, that you have is going to depend upon what happens when you die. Like, what do you want to happen if you were to pass away? If you want the property to be able to be left to your heirs, then this is not for you. You shouldn't own it as joint tenancy. The only one that's inheritable so that your heirs could get it is this one. So the practice test questions I've seen about this like to say something like this. 3 owners own the property, Pam, Jim, and Toby, for instance, and Toby writes a will so that his part of ownership goes to his spouse and kids when he dies. He writes it up in a will, and they are tenants in common, all 3 owners. And when Toby does die, what's going to happen to his part? What's going to happen to his ownership? It is going to go to his spouse and kids, as the will said. But if Toby were a joint tenant with Pam and Jim, and he wrote up a will saying, I want my portion to go to my heirs, then when he dies, his will isn't going to matter. The will not defeat the fact that he was a joint tenant. Who's going to own the property if he's a joint tenant when he dies? The surviving owners, not his heirs. So his wishes with the will aren't going to matter. Yes. Mm-hmm. No, it would be, well, let's think. There would be one loan. Well, I guess you could mortgage your portion, but it would just be against your part. The lender would say, what interest, how much interest, ownership interest do you have in this? And you'd say, well, I own half of it. And so they would only mortgage that amount of it. So yeah, there could be multiple. Yeah. The other thing about joint tenancy is that we don't really do that here. North Carolina doesn't tend to like it. It's not legally favored. In fact, in order for this to be considered joint tenancy, the attorney would have to use very specific language, very carefully worded, so that he accomplishes the goal of this joint tenancy ownership. It would need to be worded very specific to some certain case law that has happened. Case law meaning previous cases that went down in court. So that legal language would have to be very exact. It could easily not end up being joint tenancy if they mess that up. Oh, thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. Good question. What's a lien? So a lien is when a third party puts a financial obligation onto your property. And it happens in a couple of ways. You could do it yourself. When you use a mortgage to buy your property, then that mortgage company, that lender, places a lien against the property. In other words, when you go to sell the property, you've got to pay that lien off. You can't sell it without paying off that you owe that lien. Another way that a lien could be placed on a property is from property taxes. If you don't pay your property taxes by a certain deadline for that property, the government can put a lien on the property so that when you do finally sell it, you're going to have to pay off that lien. If you were to have a plumber do work on your house and you didn't pay them, they could put a lien on your property for the amount that you owe them. So a lien is a non-possessory interest. Somebody that doesn't own your property, doesn't get to use it, can put a financial obligation onto your property for some reason because you haven't paid something. Does that help? Good. Thanks for letting me know. I didn't even think about it, but that's a great question. So a great example of a lien is a mortgage itself. The mortgage itself is a lien on the property because you can't just sell the property without paying off that mortgage. Joint tenancy, again, is not favored over tenants in common. That's the more common one. It's got that built-in right of survivorship, so you could have that without getting married. It also has these 4 unities of possession. In order to accomplish joint tenancy, you would all have to buy it at the same time. So I've seen this test question quite a bit. 3 people buy it together as joint tenants, and then one of them maybe next year decides to sell their piece. First of all, are they going to all own the same amounts together? 3 people, or what's 1 divided by 3? 33.33%, right? 1/3. So all of them are going to own even amounts. With joint tenancy, it's even ownership. If you wanted to buy it, I always use this example, maybe boyfriend, girlfriend, they graduate college, they decide to buy something together. He's sort of a creative type. He's still finding himself. She gets her act together. She has a real job and actually money, and she puts a significant portion of the down payment on the property, maybe like 80% of it. And he comes up with 20% for the down payment. And she says, well, you're cute and all, but you're crazy if you think I'm going to be a 50-50 owner with you, because I have significantly more of my money into this purchase than you do. Therefore, we're going to own it as tenants in common, so I can have like 80% ownership and you have 20. They would have to do it that way if that's what was going to be accomplished. In order to be tenants in common, in order to have uneven ownership, they would need to be tenants in common. And then, let's see, there we go. But here's the other thing about tenancy in common. What happens when he goes mountain climbing and falls off the cliff and dies? There is no right of survivorship. It goes to his heirs. Who are his heirs? He has no kids. Next in line, his parents. Those horrible parents that she hates and hates her. Nobody likes either one. So she gets to be a co-owner with his parents because it's tenants in common, because that's his heirs. If they wanted right of survivorship, then joint tenancy might have been a better choice, or getting married and doing by the entirety, but that wouldn't have allowed for uneven ownership either. So you've got to kind of figure out what it is you're trying to accomplish. Now, I'm showing you these things, and we're kind of talking in absolutes. Here's what tenants in common is, here's what joint is, and here's what by the entirety is. But in real life, you can pretty much have an attorney tailor make your ownership exactly how you want it. But for this test, for this class, you need to know these things as we're teaching them to you. Just kind of know, here's what joint tenancy tends to look like, and answer the questions in that way. So joint tenancy means if you buy it together, you're a joint tenant with those folks. So it could look like, yeah, here we go. Jim, Pam, and Toby own it, buy it together at the same time as joint tenants, but then Toby later sells his portion to Oscar. Well, because Oscar wasn't in there as a buyer originally, Oscar cannot be a joint tenant. The only way you can be a joint tenant owner is if you bought it originally together at the same time. So Oscar would be a tenant in common, while Pam and Jim are their only remaining joint tenants. You with me? I've seen that test question pop up. They still own it as joint tenants because they were the original buyers, but Oscar came along later, so he's a tenant in common. Then we've got this right of survivorship. Kelly is one of 4 owners. She dies and has a will leaving her ownership, her share, to her spouse and kids, but it's joint tenancy. And since it has right of survivorship, what happens to the property when she dies? She owns it as a joint tenant, but she tries to leave it in her will. So what's going to happen? Is she going to success? There you go. Now, instead of 4 owners, it's only 3, and the spouse and kids of Kelly are out. Sorry, they don't get it. What Kelly should have done when she was still alive is to convince Pam, Jim, and Toby to rewrite the deed. Let's have an attorney rewrite this thing as tenants in common together so that we can each, if we want to, leave our share to our respective heirs, right? So Kelly's wishes cannot be met. Joint tenancy has right of survivorship, which says the remaining 3 owners get the property instead of her heirs. So what are the main differences between tenants in common and joint tenants? Tenants in common allows for uneven ownership, unequal shares. Joint tenants are assumed to be equal shares. Tenants in common are allowed to buy at different times. Joint tenants must buy at the same time in order to still be considered joint tenants. And then in tenants in common, if somebody dies, then their will is what determines what happens to their ownership share. But with joint tenancy, when an owner dies, their portion gets assumed by the other surviving owners. This type of content would show up on the national portion of the real estate exam. But remember, joint tenancy is not something favored in North Carolina. So, owners that want the fewest limitations on their ownership would want which type of tenancy? Which of those 3 types has the fewest ownership limitations? Can do the most with it. You don't have as many restrictions. Tenants in common, joint tenancy, or by the entirety? Well, tenants in common allows for uneven amounts of ownership, and it allows for buying it or owning it at different times, buying in at different times. So yeah, that's the best answer. That's the most flexible. That's the fewest limitations. Now that's how to own something with other owners. Let's talk about property, actual types of property. And we're talking about hybrid forms of ownership. There's 4 types here. What is a condominium? What's a townhouse? What's a cooperative? And what's a timeshare? What do you need to know about a condominium? A condominium, this is actually, I didn't really notice this until last time, but I guess what I have here is a hospital room. But let's pretend that's a regular bed, not a hospital bed. But it's a lovely condo except for the hospital bed. What you own in a condo is the painted surface to the painted surface. You don't own the thickness of the wall or the roof or the exterior stuff. You officially own just the airspace. So as a condominium owner, you own the interior painted surface to painted surface. But as we all know, in a condominium complex, there are common areas that everybody shares, like the swimming pool, tennis court, clubhouse, sidewalks, maybe the foyer, maybe there's a weight room in the clubhouse. Those are all called common areas because every co-owner, all those owners of various condos get to use those common areas. And so who owns them though? All of the owners own the common areas as tenants in common. So that's the big difference between a condo and a townhouse. When we get to the townhouse, you'll see the difference. The HOA, Homeowner Association, owns the townhouse common areas, but with a condominium, all the unit owners are co-owners as tenants in common of those common areas. So what's happening here in a condo? You've got a fee simple, some sort of fee simple ownership for the unit itself, but then a tenants in common ownership with all the other owners of their units for the common areas. And you've got different kinds of common elements. You've got the ones that everybody has access to, maybe the pool and the weight room, but then maybe it's at the lake. And so not everybody has a boat slip. If you pay extra, you also get a boat slip and get that bit of limited common element. So you could have something like that, or pay extra for gym access, or maybe some of them have garages available, but not enough for everyone. So if you pay extra, a limited common element might be a garage, a single car garage or something. So the other thing about a condo is when it's new, this thing called the North Carolina Condo Act of 1986 applies to it. It's only for new construction condos, doesn't apply to townhouses or PUDs, planned unit developments, only condos that are new. And what happens is the condo developer has to do some stuff. The developer of a new construction condo complex must record a plat map of the whole community. What's a plat map? That's a map showing where all of the condo buildings are in relation to the other elements, the common elements. And it just kind of spreads, draws it out. So let's see here. That plat map must be put on the public record. Let me share that with you. Here we go. Hopefully this will get a little more clear. So that will be what a plat map might look like. It's a survey, right? It's a survey of the entire community, and it shows the buildings that exist, unit 13, unit 14, like in this case, looks like this is 2 condos in one building, but it might be many more. And they show some future expansion as well. And then where the roads are. And then if you see some dotted lines, things that apply to like setback lines and easements. Can the utility company come across the property to access their big green box for the easements, stuff like that. And then you'll notice it's got a stamp from a surveyor because someone actually surveyed it. And it is registered, it is recorded at the County Register of Deeds. So once it gets recorded, they'll fill in this information and it will be put on the public record. So anytime that you want to check out the Register of Deeds, you can just do a search for the county in question and look up the Register of Deeds office. And you can do that search and find, there it is, Register of Deeds indexes, and then find things like property deeds and mortgages, deeds of trust, and just do a search like that, and it'll show. I don't have an example to show you, but I will show you another time. But that's what we mean by a plat map, a recorded plat map. There we go. Another thing a developer of a condo, new construction condo, has to do is record something called a declaration. And they're pretty much saying, here's what we're doing. Here's what we're building. And then they also have to create an owners association, a governing body, that unit owners association, like a homeowners association. Things to, a body of owners to help enforce the rules. Make sure people are doing the right thing, not leaving their garbage out in the hallway or parking too many cars and only using their spaces, whatever they're supposed to do to follow those rules. But here's the biggest one. Here's the big testable item that I see pop up. The North Carolina Condo Act of 1986 pertains to new construction condos, which means it includes 7 days for the buyer to back out of a sale. Once they agree to buy it, they don't have to buy it. They have 7 days to back out if they want to, but only for new construction condos. So that's the big thing that's special about new construction condominiums. A 7-day, something called a right of rescission. You can rescind the contract, back out of it, as long as you do so within 7 days from the date of it. And that's, again, only for new construction condos. So besides that, The thing about condos was you have a fee simple ownership of the unit and a tenants in common ownership along with your other neighbors for the common areas. A townhouse is different. In a condo, you owned just the painted surfaces, right? Wall to wall, interior airspace. With a townhouse, you own the dirt that's sitting on too. So you own this vertical ownership, the structure itself and the land it sits upon. And many times, as you probably know, townhouses have a little courtyard in the back. So you own that dirt too, right? You have that little 8 by 10 foot yard back there. So condos could be considered horizontal ownership. Townhomes would be considered vertical because you own the dirt as well. The other big difference is that the common elements in a townhome community, you could have a tennis court, swimming pool, clubhouse, just like you can with a condo, but you don't own it as tenants in common with your co-owners. The homeowners association owns it. The HOA owns the common elements, and then you have the right to use them because you're an owner of one of those townhouses in there. It might be that just because we're looking at something that looks like a townhouse, it's officially being handled as a condo. So if we look at this building right here, you won't necessarily know. You might guess, yeah, that looks like a townhouse to me. But it could be that once you look at the legal papers, they actually treat it like a condo, and you don't own that land if you own this thing. You only own the interior airspace. So beware of that as a broker out there. It might look like a condo, but it's really a townhouse or vice versa. You got to find out. It's not just the way it looks. Got to see what is actually the ownership. Is it airspace or is it the dirt too? Another one, which we don't see very much here in North Carolina, is a co-op or cooperative ownership. Anybody ever heard of a co-op? I've heard of them in bigger cities, New York, right? Chicago, maybe. What you own when it's a cooperative like this is a share of stock in the corporation that owns the building. It probably looks like an apartment or a condo, but the structure of it legally is you own a share of stock in the corporation, and then you have a proprietary lease that gives you the right to occupy the actual unit itself. So with a co-op, you have two documents: the share of stock, the stock certificate, and the proprietary lease that lets you occupy. That's about it. We don't do co-ops much here, so we don't need to dig too deeply into this. And then finally, a timeshare. Anybody ever owned a timeshare or sat in on a sales pitch for a timeshare? If it was in North Carolina, was it in North Carolina? I'm curious. No. Florida maybe, or Nevada, something like that, Florida. I wonder if it's that way down there. But in North Carolina, the timeshare developer and the salespeople both have to have real estate licenses. I wonder if that means that a sales pitch in North Carolina maybe isn't quite so obnoxious and like just awful. Did you get the thing that you went to for free? Was it worth the 4 hours of the sales pitch? Okay, good. They did pay off for you. Did you buy the thing? I wonder what the success rate is. I doubt it's much better than 50-50, but a lot of people try to sell their timeshares. But in North Carolina, the timeshare developer has to have a real estate license, and the timeshare salesperson does too. And you can remember pretty much what you need to know by these 5 numbers: 5, 5, 5, 10, 5. What is a timeshare? It's the right to occupy this property for an amount of time over the course of at least 5 years. At least 5 years. So if the test question says so-and-so has the right to occupy for 5 times over the course of 3 years, then it's not classified as a timeshare. So it's the right to occupy it at least 5 times over at least 5 years. And then there's a built-in 5-day right of rescission. You can have buyer's remorse and back out within 5 days. I wonder if that was the case in Florida or not. But in North Carolina, it is 5 days built in. And then the developer has to hold your deposit money for 10 days. It's called earnest money deposit. That must be held in the account for 10 days so they can give it back to you if you choose to rescind, for one thing. And then the last 5 is 500. If the developer violates of any provision of the Timeshare Act, which is basically legislation put in place that they have to follow when they're building a timeshare development, if they make a violation or violate the Timeshare Act, they are fined $500. And remember, I just said a timeshare developer has to have a real estate license. So a timeshare developer is a type of licensee. And so what we learned last week was that the Real Estate Commission does not fine licensees. What they do to us is either reprimand, censure, suspend, or revoke, but this is one exception. So if the test question were to say which type of licensee could be fined by the Real Estate Commission, the answer would be a timeshare developer. But that's it. Not me, because I don't do timeshare developing. They can't fine me. They could do those other 4 things, but they're never going to fine somebody like me as long as I don't do timeshares, right? If I'm not a developer of timeshares. We okay with this? Need time to, you want to make a screenshot of it or anything? Let me know if I go too fast for such a thing, and I'll always go back. So a timeshare salesperson must have a real estate license, and timeshares are regulated by the commission. They're given a certificate of registration. And that's it. That's all you need to know about these hybrid forms of ownership. Those are the testable items from those different 4 ways to own something. If an owner has title to the unit and owns the common area along with the other owners, then what are we talking about? What type of hybrid ownership is this thing? What is this property? Title to the unit as well as a common area shared as tenants in common. You got it. That's a condo. If they have title to the unit and they own the land and the building, their portion of the building, yeah, title to the unit plus the dirt that it sits on is a townhouse. Well done. If they own a share of stock and have a proprietary lease for their own unit, what are we talking about? And that's a co-op, you bet. And if they have ownership for a period of time, either they're owning it or leasing it for an amount of time, they have a timeshare. Well done. Okay, let's talk about trusts. You could own property in the name of a trust, but let's get spread out a little far out from that. When you have a trust, it could be real estate, it could be money in that trust. There is a grantor of the trust giving it to a beneficiary, right? But they don't want that beneficiary to have access to it right away. Maybe that beneficiary needs to reach a certain age, or maybe they need to graduate from college, or something has to happen in order for them to have access to this stuff, these assets that are in this trust. And so therefore, who is it once the grantor passes away? Who enforces this thing? Who oversees it? That's the trustee, right? That's probably an attorney, a third-party trustee that holds those assets for that beneficiary and says, okay, we'll give you just enough to pay this upcoming tuition bill, but until you graduate college, you're not going to have the entire $3 million or whatever it might be, right? A living trust is something that lasts during a lifetime. A testamentary trust has to do with what's in your wills. A land trust deals with just real estate. Another kind of trust is something called a REIT, R-E-I-T, a real estate investment trust. It's basically stocks, but it's real estate instead of stocks. You don't own a stock in a company, but because you own a piece of this real estate investment trust, what you own is based upon these chunks of real estate that are owned by this entity in which you own a share. So it's a way to invest in real estate without having to get your hands dirty, right? You can be the silent partner, so to speak. You own a share of a REIT, real estate investment trust. You don't get to pick the property. You don't get to see about it being managed or collect the rent or do the upgrades or the construction, but you own a share of it. So for trusts, the terminology is the one who creates that trust and is giving these assets is the trustor or the grantor. You'll notice that the one giving a thing, the word ends in OR. The one making the offer is the offeror when we get to that chapter about offers and contracts. So the grantor is the giver of the trust or the one who created it. The beneficiary receives that trust or receives eventually the assets in the trust. And then the one who is controlling it is called the trustee. They have what's called a fiduciary interest. They have the trust of the trust, right? They're entrusted with taking care of it and seeing that it complies with the grantor's wishes. You could own your real estate in the name of a trust, and it's got certain advantages that we'll talk about later. But another way that property could be given to someone is through probate. Probate has to do with what happens when you die. If anybody has ever had to be the executor of someone's estate, I've had to do that before for my mom. But I was the executor. I had to start and open the estate. I had to start the probate process. It's that process for distributing the assets of someone who passes away. And there's certain timelines involved. You've got to do certain things in certain times. And the person responsible for opening probate, which means you go down to the courthouse and you go in and you say, this person died, here's the death certificate. I want to start this. I want to open probate for them. That person is called the executor. And my favorite word in real estate is the word for a female executor, which is executrix. There's not many IX words out there. I think I might just call myself an executrix. I can do that in this day and age, right? So an executor, executrix is responsible for opening probate. And part of it is to put it on public notice. You have to, when mom died, I had to publish in the newspaper that she died, and therefore any creditors that she might have owed would have had like a 30-day window to come forward and say, yeah, she owed me some money. And then from her assets, from her estate, I would have had to pay them if they could prove it, right? And go through the proper channels. So giving public notice to creditors of any owed money, outstanding money that's owed to them by the one who died. Holding real estate in a trust is a way that you could avoid having to let that real estate go through this probate process. I was fortunate because I had already bought the property, my mom's house, from her years before. So she didn't officially own property. She lived in it, obviously, but I was the owner. So I didn't have to her house didn't have to go through probate. But if it had, we would have had to wait for that amount of time to see if any creditors came forward and whatever assets were in the bank accounts. And if I had to settle up or sell a car or the real estate itself, I could have, if with big enough claims from creditors, I might have had to sell the property to pay off those creditors. But it was thankfully not that extreme. So one way to avoid having to let the real estate go through this probate process is to not own it, or to own it in a trust instead of outright. We've already talked about an appurtenance. We know that that's something that runs with the land. It's a benefit to the property. But the opposite of that is a burden on the property. Another word is called an encumbrance. So appurtenance versus an encumbrance. An encumbrance is a burden on the land. One of those types of encumbrances we've already talked about, and that's a lien. So we'll get to that in a minute. But an encumbrance could be a claim, some sort of a financial claim that attaches to the real estate. anything that affects the title, so that it's not a nice clear title, because someone else has maybe an ownership interest in the property. They come forward and claim that they own 10% of it, and so you can't just sell it without their permission. If they can prove that they're a co-owner, a right held by a party that's not an owner, that could be an encumbrance. Such a thing would be called maybe an easement. They're not an owner, but they get to use it. Maybe they get to use it and walk across it, part of it, to access a power line. A utility easement, for instance, would be an encumbrance. It's a burden on the property. You can't avoid it. You have to allow it to happen. An encumbrance could affect how you're allowed to use the property. It could also, because, for instance, that utility easement might mean that you're not allowed to put up a fence, because that utility company needs to be able to get to their stuff, get to their power line or their little green box with their electronics in it. So you may not be able to fence the yard quite the right way or the way you want to, because without them having access into the fence, right? Couldn't just be a locked gate all the time. So it could affect how you use it. It could also affect the value, because another type of encumbrance is the next thing we're going to talk about, a lien on the property. A third party can attach a lien to your property that you have to pay off in order to sell your property. If you ever go to sell it, that lien is going to have to be paid. And so depending on how big that lien is, and maybe there's a bunch of them, somebody that's got a lien on the property, they're in financial difficulty. And so they might have multiple liens on the property. Maybe they have like $20,000 worth of liens on the property from 5 or 6 different people, and including taxes being late. Well, they could still sell the property, even though it has all those liens on it. But do you think the buyer is going to be willing to pay them top dollar? No. If that buyer buys the property subject to those liens, meaning they're going to have to pay them themselves, they're going to expect to get a heck of a deal for that property. They're not going to want to pay the full market value. Say it's worth $350,000, but it's got $20,000 of liens on it. A buyer could still buy a property with liens in place. Those liens called encumbrances, right? But they're going to not pay $300,000. They're probably going to only pay maybe $200,000, maybe $150,000. They're going to expect a discount, because they know they have to use their own money to pay the liens put upon them by the seller. So therefore, it doesn't prevent transferring the title or selling the property. You could still sell it even if it's got encumbrances on it. Another kind of encumbrance is what we're seeing at the bottom, that yellow squiggly line and the red line. That next door property was built over the property line. It is an encumbrance on this property because it is encroaching across the property line. An encroachment is another type of encumbrance. So let's look at some encumbrances. A lien. You could say it this way: all liens are encumbrances, but not all encumbrances are liens. There are more kinds of encumbrances than just liens, but a lien is one of them, and it has to do with unpaid debt. You haven't paid your debts, therefore that person that you owe can put a lien on your property. Again, you won't be able to sell your property without paying them what you owe them. It could be a mortgage. You got to pay off that lender whenever you sell your property. It could be a tax lien. You didn't pay your property taxes, so the government put a lien on the property. Now, if you choose to sell your house, you're going to have to pay back those taxes because it's a lien. Or a mechanic's lien. That's what it is called when it's like a vendor, maybe a roofer, plumber, electrician that you've hired to do work. And because you haven't paid them, they could place a lien on your property so that when you do sell it, they're going to get paid. So a lien is a type of an encumbrance. Notice, again, a burden on the property. A lien is a burden on the property. So is an easement. An easement is giving access to someone else, not the owner, a third party, maybe a utility company. And it could be your neighbor has an easement on your property because their driveway has to go across your yard in order to get to the street. in North Carolina at least, you can't sell landlocked property. Any property has to have access to a right of way. So it might look something like this. You've got two properties. This owner A and this owner B. And then here's the road out here. And then here is A's house. Ooh, that's a nice house. There we go. And then here's the driveway. You can't lock A into their property. They have to have access to a right of way. So B would allow this easement, this driveway easement, so that A could get out to the road. And they just have to let him do it. So when B sells the property, the easement remains. That still has to be allowed by any future owners as well. And it's called an appurtenant easement also, because we know appurtenances run with the property. So a driveway could be an appurtenant easement. It runs with the property. It could also be that across B's land here off to the side, there's an easement so that the power company can get back here because maybe there's a power pole or a box that has like the telephone stuff in it. And so there's an easement, and B can't build like a fence that cuts off that easement and keeps somebody from being able to access what they're required, what they're allowed to have access to. So an easement is just a right to access property given to a third party. An encroachment is what happens when your neighbor's building is over your property line onto your property, or yours over theirs. So it would look like this. So you got your neighbor's house, and you have your house here. Your neighbor's got their little driveway, and you got your driveway. Maybe you decide to build a shed in the backyard, and you don't get a survey. And when you build the shed, oops, looks like a little corner of it is over the property line onto the neighbor's property. What you have here is an encroachment. It is encroaching onto the neighbor's land. Well, maybe the neighbor builds a building and they don't get a survey either. And oops, now they've encroached upon your land. Or maybe it's a fence thing. I once had a sale where the my client bought a house in Mooresville, historic Mooresville, and the fence looked perfectly straight. It was like it went this way, came up. I think it actually, here's the backyard and here's the fence. And it was pretty much an exact rectangle. And then here's the road out here. There's a pretty decent front yard. And here's the road. And we had the survey done. I suggested to my buyers to have it surveyed. Turns out that the actual property line did this. So the fence was like 5 or 6 feet over the line back here onto the neighbor's property. And when we asked the buyer, when we asked the seller, the listing agent who asked the seller said, well, I had a survey done. I put up the fence, but I did have a survey done, and the surveyor was wrong, apparently. But our surveyor was right. And so my buyers had to decide, are we okay with this fence going over this line? It was like an 8-foot fence. And we got it priced to have redone the fence would have been like $5,000 or $6,000 or something crazy. The parties agreed to sign a piece of paper saying, yeah, it's okay for this thing to be encroaching. But that's another type of encumbrance, an encroachment like that. So crossing that property line could be a driveway, a detached garage, a fence. There's other kinds of encumbrances too, but we'll talk about those after break. I'll see you in 10. welcome back. Almost done, guys. Hang in there. You just stretch it out, shake it out, stand up. That's okay. Do what you got to do. So we've got some encumbrances called a lien, an easement, an encroachment. There are some other types of encumbrances. What is an encumbrance again, by the way? Tell me what do I mean by encumbrance? Yeah, let's get a little more specific. Is it a positive or a negative? Is it a benefit or a burden? Yeah, it's a burden. So some other burdens on real estate could be these things. You could have a deed restriction. In fact, if we go back to that crazy freehold estate material we covered a couple hours ago, fee simple defeasible is sort of an encumbrance, isn't it? It's a condition on the property, right? There are other deed restrictions that could be put on the property too. A seller could say, you know what, this is my family land, therefore I will let developers develop it, but only if they make lot sizes that are no smaller than 2 acres, right? They don't want to see these little teensy lots. Or no townhouses, only single family on larger lots. They could say, I'll sell you this property, developer. A developer wants to buy the property from them. Maybe it's 20 acres to build a house, a neighborhood on, housing neighborhood. And they would say, well, I only want it to be houses that are made of all brick and only single story only, all brick homes. Those could be in the deed restrictions. What are the restrictions that you can use how you can use the property? What are the restrictions as to how you can use the property? Another kind of encumbrance would be a restrictive covenant. Restrictive covenants have to do with like a neighborhood, more neighborhood rules. Maybe like the fence heights, no fences taller than 6 feet. And they can't be chain link. They have to be a certain style, maybe vinyl or metal, aluminum, but not chain link. So restrictive covenants are something that's a material fact. You have to disclose that as a broker. You have to be able to tell people what's allowable use for this property. Any deed restrictions, any restrictive covenants that the buyers need to know about. Some other kinds of encumbrances have to do with the legal system. A lis pendens means litigation is pending. Lis pendens, just think of it that way. We're not sure what's going to happen, but this property is tied up in a court case. That litigation is pending. So whatever that court case results in against this property is going to be something that will be determined later, but that will be an encumbrance potentially. A writ of attachment and then any pending lawsuits, those two things are more kinds of encumbrances. So as to liens, because remember, liens were the first kind of encumbrance we were talking about. Now we're talking specifically about liens, and you've got two broad kinds. I call them happy liens and sad liens, because happy liens are voluntary. You've chosen to put this lien on the property. Why would you choose to put a lien on the property? Because if you didn't put that lien, this kind of lien, a mortgage lien, you wouldn't be able to buy it. You've got to borrow the money in order to buy it. Therefore, you have to have a mortgage, and the lender requires a lien to be placed on the property. That lien, again, means that you can't sell the property without paying your lender back in full. So that mortgage lien is a voluntary lien. You're happy about it because otherwise you wouldn't have been able to buy the property probably. An involuntary lien, not so happy. It's because of a sad thing, either a judgment in a lawsuit. The judge decided that you lose, therefore they're putting a lien on the property because you lost the lawsuit. Or it could be a foreclosure. That would be an involuntary lien on the property, or a tax lien because you didn't pay your property taxes. And these lien holders, the ones who get paid back for these liens that are put on there, they don't have the right to use it. they can't come onto your property and use it and rent it and throw a party, but they do have a financial interest against your property that would have to be paid when you do go to sell it. Now, more categories of liens. Think of it as two buckets of liens, right? One of them is specific to the property itself. Liens that are specific to the property itself would include like a mortgage, because that's all about the property itself. You had to get that mortgage to buy that property. A general lien would be something that applies to both you, the person, as well as your property. So a general lien would include the IRS putting a lien against your property because you didn't pay your income tax. That's a general lien. It's more than just the property itself. It's on you personally, right? So the bucket of specific liens, if you had a whole bunch of liens outstanding against your property, your specific liens are going to get paid first once the property sells. You got to pay those ones back first. They're more important. They have a higher priority. They have a higher level. They are considered superior. Specific liens are superior to general liens. General liens also include like car tax liens, income tax for both state of North Carolina and federal IRS, any sort of court-ordered judgment liens. Those are all what we were talking about with general liens. And they're not going to get paid until the specific liens are all paid, right? So, liens that are specific against the property itself include property tax because it's paying the tax for owning that property. Therefore, real property tax is a type of specific lien. Specific to what? Specific to the property, the real estate in question that we're talking about. Another kind of specific lien would be if, for instance, the government decided they wanted to put street lights down the street. And so you got a street light in front of your house. Well, that needs to be paid for. And because you're benefiting from this street light, you got to pay for it. You and all your neighbors that got street lights down this stretch of road are all going to be given a special assessment, or charged, I should say it, not given, but charged a special assessment. And they'll spread it out over time. They won't make you pay the $3,000 all at once. They'll say you get to only pay, you just can pay $200 a month for the next 3 years because we put curb and gutter in front of your house, or put sidewalks in front of your house, or street lights, or whatever it was. So a special assessment lien, because you didn't pay your special assessment. Maybe you thought, well, shoot, I didn't want that sidewalk anyway. I don't want people walking in front of my house, so I refuse to pay it. Well, if it's a special assessment and you refuse to pay it, eventually it could turn into a lien against your property because you didn't pay it. And that's a government specific one, right? The government is putting a special assessment lien on your property because you didn't pay it as you're supposed to. So that's another type of specific lien because it's specific to your house. Once you sell your house, that special assessment lien is going to get paid off. Another one is the mortgage. In North Carolina, we call a mortgage a deed of trust. So you might see that phrase used a lot, but it's the same idea. A mortgage meaning you borrowed money to buy the house. That mortgage is officially the thing that puts the house up as collateral for that loan that you got for buying the house. In other words, it's the thing that allows the lender to foreclose on you and take the house back if you don't make your payment. So a mortgage is basically a pledging of the house as collateral. And another word for mortgage is a deed of trust. So it's basically a mortgage in North Carolina. We call it a deed of trust in North Carolina. If it's South Carolina, for instance, calls it a mortgage. We'll talk more about that when we get to the finance chapter. You could have also hired a plumber, and maybe they didn't do work to suit you, or for some reason you couldn't afford to pay them, and they felt like you probably weren't going to pay them. And so they went ahead to the courthouse and put a lien on your property called a mechanic's lien. Mechanic doesn't just mean working on cars. It means just doing work on the property. And so since they did work on your property or provided materials for it, then they can put a lien on it if you don't pay. And therefore, since it's about your specific property, it is a specific lien. Seeing the theme emerge here? In commercial real estate, a broker could be hired to sell that commercial building. They're going to list for sale that commercial building. There'll be a listing agent. And it's in commercial real estate only that I'm talking about this. But if that owner chooses to not pay the real estate commission that they agreed to pay to the agent, then in commercial real estate, that agent could put a lien on the property for their commission. Wouldn't that be nice if we could do that in residential? But we can't. There is no residential broker lien, but there is a commercial broker lien. And that means the broker who listed the property and then the owner didn't end up selling it. They ended up trying to screw the broker out of the commission. The broker could put a lien against the property so that when it does finally sell, even if it sells with some other broker, that broker who put the lien on it could get their commission then. So all of these are very specific to the property itself. A general lien is going to be against the property of the owner, but also their personal property too. So again, general liens is where we'd find IRS income tax lien. You didn't pay your taxes, IRS, therefore they put a lien on you. Once you sell your real estate, you still have that IRS lien, right? If you didn't have enough money to pay them all back completely, that still rides on your shoulders. It's not cleared up because you sold a piece of real estate. It's still on you. North Carolina Department of Revenue, same way. A judgment lien ordered by a judge in court. All of these things are considered general liens as compared to specific liens. Here's that commercial broker lien I was talking about. Again, it's to protect the commission of a real estate broker in a commercial transaction. Now, in order for them to be able to put a lien on the property, they would need to have a written agreement showing proof that they were hired originally, a written agency agreement that this owner did try to list the property with them. And again, it only applies to commercial, whether you're helping them sell or helping them lease. And then they try to do you out of that commission they promised to pay you. And so you could place this commercial broker lien on the property. And that would be a specific lien. Now, that mechanics lien we talked about has some time frames required. You can't just be a person who did some plumbing and you got a feeling the owner's not going to pay you, so you decide to throw a lien on the property. You've got to do it within a certain set of days. And so here's what it looks like. Say a plumber starts work on August 3rd. They start work on August 3rd, and that could be that they start work or they even just have materials delivered to the property, either one. Either starting the work or materials first delivered. Let's call that August 3rd. And then later, just an arbitrary amount of time later that I just picked for the sake of the example, August 17th, that plumber stops doing work on the property. Maybe she gets a funny feeling the owner's not going to pay her. She's overheard some talk or a phone call or the owner's being a jerk. Somehow or other, the plumber stops doing work. As long as that plumber, sometime within the next 120 days of the date she stops doing the work, or the date she last provided materials, within 120 days, she's got to file a mechanics lien against the property. She would go down to the courthouse, register of deeds, where that's located, and file this mechanics lien. But she's got to do it within 120 days. In this case, if I added up my days right, she would have to do it by December 16th. That's the 120th day from the last day she did work. Once she files that lien within those 120 days, then her place in line, like if there's other liens on the property, because quite frequently if there's one, there's probably many. The person's probably not paying lots of different people. then her place in line is determined by that date that she first did work. So that's what gets confusing about this. That's why I wrote it out like this as a timeline so you could kind of see it. It's also in the Notion software, Notion Classroom. I put this as a graphic in there for you. So again, needs to file the lien within 120 days of the last day work was done. But what if that plumber decides, yeah, let's go ahead and actively pursue this lien? Then she would have 180 days after that last day of doing work to go ahead and say, yeah, I want my money. I want to exercise the lien. I want to execute the lien. As long as she can prove that she filed it within the 120 days, I'm under the purple February 14th thing, then she retains the right to actually pursue in court against the owner to enforce the lien. The lien must be enforced within 180 days. It must be filed within 120 days. Days from when? Days from the last date the work was provided or materials provided. And then when does her place in line? Where is her place in line at this point? It goes retroactive, goes all the way back to the first date work was done or provided or materials provided. So spend some time. Let me see. Let me make sure it's in there. Here's Notion. I'll double check and make sure it's in there and get it over to you. There it is. Oops. All right. Yeah. So there's Notion. I can't zoom into these things on Notion, but on the left side, you'll see a list of various attachments, and one of them is the mechanics lien. There we go. I put it right there in the body of it too. Oops. There we go. Okay, so you can see that same graphic. Now, how do these liens affect real estate? They could reduce the property value. Remember, a buyer could still choose to buy it, even if it has a bunch of liens on it, as long as that buyer is willing and able to pay off those liens. But you better believe that buyer is going to want to pay a reduced price for the property because they're going to have to pay off some liens. So yes, you could still sell a property with liens in place as long as you disclose them, as long as that buyer is told about them. So does an encumbrance or a lien prevent the transfer of property? Yep, a grantee cannot refuse an easement as an encumbrance, for instance. That grantee could agree to assume responsibility for a lien. There you go. Good way to say it. Just makes it trickier. Now, if we owe a bunch of people some money, lots of different liens are on your property and on you. You've got an IRS lien. You've got a state of North Carolina income tax you didn't pay. You got a property tax lien. You've got a couple of mechanics liens. It's just been a bad year. There's a certain order in which these liens would be repaid. If you do sell the property or get foreclosed on, these liens have to be repaid. And not just anybody in any random order. Here's what it looks like. Basically, it's the term is North Carolina is a pure race to the courthouse state, right? Whoever gets there first and records their lien first wins. That's who gets paid first because, quite frankly, the money might run out. Maybe you've got 9 different liens, but you get down to the sixth one and all the money is gone. So sorry, 7, 8, and 9, you don't get any. if you're a specific lien specific to the property. So what is the lien priority? Well, always number one, this is testable. Write this one down in the notes. Always in the first position is property tax. That's who gets paid first. If there's a tax lien and there's a bunch of other ones, all those others have to wait. The property tax lien gets paid first, the real property tax. And then always in the number two position are government special assessment liens. Special assessment liens. You didn't pay the special assessment for the street light, then that's going to get paid right after that property tax gets paid. And then what comes next is any specific liens that are specific to the property. That bucket of potential liens specific to the property. And what order do they get paid? Whatever order that they were recorded in. Whoever recorded first, right? It's just up to the order of being recorded. And then once all those specific liens are repaid, the general ones, the ones that apply to both the property and the person. And that's in the order of recordation as well. Whoever got to the courthouse and recorded their lien first is in the superior position compared to the other ones. So notice that the specific liens are all ahead of the general liens, and that property tax is ahead of everybody, and that special assessment is ahead of everybody except property tax. So that's the general order of everybody. So if we had a situation like this, property owner has several liens against them. We've got an IRS income tax lien from July 15th of 2017. We've got a North Carolina Department of Revenue lien of March 9th of 17. We've got a mortgage from February of 19. We've got a mechanics lien for a plumber from August of 2020 and a property tax lien of October of 21. These dates are the dates when each one was recorded at the courthouse. And for the mechanics lien, that 8/4 is the date that plumber first did work on the property. So what would be the order? Let me change the chat first so that it's only me seeing the answers. And when you get the right order, leave it in the chat for me, and then we'll look at it. Remember the difference between a specific lien and a general lien. Make sure that you keep that in mind. Things that are specific to the property versus on the person themselves. The ones specific to the property are ahead of the ones on the person themselves. So first step would be figuring out what's always the first position, if it's in there. Second step would be what's always in the second position, if it's one of the choices. Third step would be which of these are specific to the property. And then finally, which of these are not property specific. What's the one that's always number one, no matter what? Always in the first position. Yeah, there you go. Real property tax. That's number one. Do we have a special assessment lien in here at all? There is none. They didn't have any special assessments, so that's automatically number two. And since it's not there, We don't deal with that. But now we're going to need to figure out the specific liens. Which ones out of this group, besides property tax, are specific to the property itself? Just two of them. Yep. Mortgage is one and mechanics is the other. There you go. So those need to be put in order based on their dates, order of recordation. And then finally, the general liens are what? Which one are in the general bucket? Liens that are on the person. IRS, North Carolina Revenue. There you go. So it looks like this. We've got property tax first, always. We've got mortgage and mechanics as the two specific liens, and they're only in this order because the mortgage one happened to be on the property first. If the mechanics lien was before it, that would be first. And then finally, the general liens are the last two. And notice the North Carolina one is first because that was first recorded. Nope, it's order of recordation. Federal doesn't trump state. It's whichever was recorded first. Good question. Property tax is always first, then specific liens in their order of recordation, and then general liens in their order of recordation. And then don't forget, for any mechanics liens, it's all about the date at which the labor or materials were first provided. So I probably should put a second mechanics lien in here to test that a little bit, but it's the date first delivery was done. A couple of the terms. There's something called a writ of attachment, which means a court order is involved creating a lien. A court order has required that a lien be put against the property because of some sort of litigation. Also, private deed restrictions. A seller could put restrictions on a property. We're done with liens for now. But a private deed restriction would be when a seller has put restrictions on the property they're selling. If you want to sell your property, you could tell that buyer what they're allowed to do with it, as we've seen. So the buyer has to either follow those instructions and directives or be sued over it. So a developer might restrict the type and size of houses that can be built. Full brick only, minimum 2,000 square feet, only single story. Or an HOA could restrict the color of the front door and the shutters or this type of fence. In fact, a private deed restriction could be more strict than a public zoning law. And what we'll see multiple times in this course and in real estate is it doesn't matter the size of the entity, like federal versus state versus local. The stricter one always wins. So if the private deed restriction says fences can't be taller than 6 feet, and the public restriction says fences can't be taller than 8 feet, the private one wins. You're capped at a 6-foot fence. You don't get to build an 8-foot one because the zoning law says 8 is okay. Since the private deed restriction says the 6 is the highest you can build, that's the one you have to follow, the stricter one. Stricter restriction always wins. Another kind of encumbrance is a lis pendens. Lis pendens is another Latin phrase. It, again, means that there's litigation. There's a lawsuit involved, and that lawsuit has not yet been determined, resolved, because it's pending, right? It's pending lawsuit, and it affects that real property. It puts a cloud on the title because we don't know yet if it's going to result in some sort of a lien, perhaps. But you could still sell it. It's just that the owner would need to be told, look, there's a lis pendens on this property. Something might end up resulting in this property having a lien on it. When there is a lis pendens, there's an order of events that are involved. The phrase is called notice of quiet title lawsuit. Notice of quiet title. So the first step would be this thing is in question. It's in court, the court system. There's a litigation concerning a thing, something. Maybe somebody's getting sued over not following a private deed restriction. So that lis pendens is filed on the public record at the courthouse. Recorded notice that there is pending litigation that we don't yet know the outcome of. Next is the court hearing where the judge affirms the claims and quiets the invalid claims. The judge looks at everything and says, do we have valid claims here? If the judge determines some claim is not valid, then that claim will be thrown out. That's what the word quiets means. And then finally, there's a court ruling that clears the cloud on the title, which perfects the title. When a title to a property, title like the deed, the ownership, like when you own your car, you have the title to the car. So the proof that you own it is what we're talking about when we say title. And so a clouded title means your ownership is in question. There's some kind of a smudge or a mark on your ownership because of a variety of things. And so that court ruling would clear the cloud on the title, would say, yep, now the title's clear. It's okay. There is no more cloud. There's no more problem here. Who always gets paid first from the proceeds of a transfer? You sell your property and there's some liens on the property. Who gets paid first? You got it. Yep. Property tax or the government, I guess we could say, because funny observation, who wrote the law that says the government, the property tax gets paid first and the special assessments by the government get paid second? The government. They put themselves first and second, right? How convenient. So they always get paid first. The government gets paid first. Not the IRS, though. The IRS is way down the list. The IRS isn't even a specific lien. The IRS is a general lien. It comes after the mechanics liens, the mortgage, it's not even in that specific lien bucket at all. It's in the general lien bucket. So watch out for that. They like to test you on that because it seems like they would win, right? It always seems like they're the ones that get paid first. Let's talk about some more encumbrances. This one is a utility easement, for instance. And that's just giving the utility company or whoever has the right to this easement the right to use someone else's land. They can walk across it. They can go access their power line, their little green boxes. This easement does not create a freehold or estate or anything. It doesn't give them ownership or possessory ownership. It's something that provides access or benefits the land, something called an easement appurtenant, like a driveway across the neighbor's yard or utility box access. It might look like this. Here's our little street there at the bottom. The house, the red house on the left, is the one whose driveway has to go across the neighbor's yard in order to get to the street. And another thing to know, some more terminology here, the one who needs to have the access to the street, that's the one receiving the benefit of that easement, and therefore they're called the dominant estate. The servient estate is the one who has to allow the driveway to go across their yard. So dominant estate versus servient estate might not be what you expected, which one it would be. So yeah, go for it. Well, in this case, it looks like they could do that, right? But let's assume that little bit of land under there is somehow not able to have a driveway. Maybe it's not even, maybe it's a gully or some kind of a ditch that you can't build on, right? For some reason you can't go across it, but I get what you're saying. A better drawing would be if the dominant estate was completely blocked by the servient estate from getting to the road. right? That'd get the point across a little more directly. So an easement appurtenant is something like this, but there's another kind of easement too. Something called an easement in gross. It's not attached to the land. It benefits an actual entity or a person, and it runs with them. It's like a railroad company. They can put those train tracks down. They have an easement in gross to put the train tracks in. So it's not attached or pertinent to any particular estate in land, doesn't belong to a person because they own the land. It's the entity or government entity, company, person who has a right to use the land of another. It's personal, and it ends with the death of that grantee. So the railroad company gets to have like a 50-foot right-of-way on either side of the train tracks to access the tracks, to work, do what they need to do for these train tracks to exist. And they have an easement in gross to do that. And once that railroad company doesn't need it anymore or changes things, then the easement in gross goes away. Easements are created several different ways. One way is in writing, or verbally, orally or in writing. That's called express. The word express means you're intentional. You're saying this is how we're going to do this thing. The opposite of express is implication or implied. That's when an easement exists because it needs to be there. The necessity for providing access would be an implied easement. So circumstances or facts require the need for it. Otherwise, the other kind is an express easement. Let's put it in writing that we're going to allow this thing. And then a third way that easements are created is because of an operation of law. One thing that you might have heard about is eminent domain. Anybody heard of eminent domain? Hands up. Yeah, that's when the government says, look, for the public good, we're going to buy all or part of your property. I remember in Charlotte years ago, W.T. Harris on the east side of Charlotte, my parents would drive down through there. There was a row of houses on both sides of the road, and it was a 2-lane road at the time, and they had big front yards. And then one day traffic cones showed up, and over the course of the next few months, those yards got chopped just about in half because the project was all about widening the road to 4 lanes. And so the government probably condemned those yards, or half of them, through eminent domain. They took them over, but they can't just take them. They have to pay you for it. But you pretty much can't really, you could officially argue it, but as long as they can prove that it is for the public good, you kind of have to go along with it. And they also have to pay you fair market value for it. So all those folks got paid for whatever dollars per acre was determined that land was worth back then. But they really couldn't do much about it. And their yards got chopped in half because the 2-lane road turning into a 4-lane road was determined to be for the good of the public. And that's condemnation through eminent domain. Another operation of law that could create an easement would be through adverse use. And that one's kind of weird. Yeah, we might get to that. Yep, 10 more minutes. Let's look at the easement by necessity first. It's because the dominant estate here needs to have access to the road that this driveway easement is necessary. So the law requires that property owners can't be landlocked. There must be a right-of-way over this neighbor's property to get to that access. That's an easement by necessity. It's necessary. A prescriptive easement is this thing. Another word for this is an adverse possession. Adverse possession. I only show the graphic of the ocean because that's the acronym, but it doesn't have anything to do with water. Ocean, OCEAN, as long as, let's think of it this way. Let's say you inherited land in the mountains and you never make it over there. You never go to the mountains. You're kind of annoyed by it. You just own this property, and over the next 20 years, maybe you visited it the first time you got it, but over the next 20 years, you never go there. It's just vacant land. And you don't even like the mountains, so you don't go. But over these 20 years, one of those owners nearby or neighbors or somebody in the area uses it. Maybe they farm it every year for 20 years, or they go across it, or they access it in some way. And as long as they use it openly, meaning not trying to hide it, not in the middle of the night, you don't know that they're using it, by the way. So as long as they use it openly and continuously every year for 20 years, and exclusively, it's not just everybody's using it. This one person is using it. And actually, and then notoriously means you don't know about it. If you did, you probably wouldn't let them use it. As long as all 5 of these things are happening, then at the end of 20 consecutive years, they could petition the court to give them ownership of the property. As long as they can prove that they used it in all 5 of these ways, openly, continuously, exclusively, actually, and notoriously. It's sort of like squatters' rights, if you've ever heard of that. So that's called acquiring property through adverse use. It normally takes 20 years to use it like this if there's a clear title, no cloud on the title, like no problems with the deed or the ownership. If there's a clouded title, like there's some kind of an issue with the title or the deed to the property, then they would only need to use it for 7 years continuously. Clouded title properties, only 7. Clear title properties, they'd have to use it for 20. So an owner could actually lose their property to somebody who uses it for a certain amount of time in these ways. And that's called a prescriptive easement due to adverse use. So you might see it referred to as adverse use or prescriptive easement. Not something I've run into on the regular course of doing real estate, but it is possible. I have heard of people, especially in the last couple of years with COVID stuff, for one reason or another, somebody sees a vacant house and they just start setting up shop in it. Maybe they can't get the power turned on to it because their name is not on the deed, but they do live there and they're trying to use it for a certain amount of time, at least 20 years, they could pull it off potentially. How could an easement go away? Termination of an easement. If it's no longer needed, it could go away if you don't need it anymore. If the easement holder buys the property where the easement's located, for instance, this dominant estate person buys the servient estate, then they don't need that easement anymore. Therefore, it goes away. Or the dominant estate could release to the servient estate. In other words, let's say there's a road back here and the dominant estate decides, you know what, let me make a driveway leading out onto this road because I like that road better anyway. I don't even want to get out to this road anymore. So therefore, they could say, hey, servient estate, I don't need this easement anymore because I'm going to start leaving my property from this other direction to this other road. So that dominant estate is releasing to the servient estate. Or the one who has the easement could abandon it. The easement's abandoned. That could be another way that it's terminated. There's another way that we could give someone permission to use the property, but it's very kind of lightweight. It doesn't give them hardly any permission to do anything other than a very specific use. And that's called a license. You could give someone a license to use your property. Oftentimes it's for fishing or for hunting. But the thing about this is they have no ownership, no possession. All they can do is use it for a limited time. It doesn't even run with the land. If you sell your property, their license that you gave them to fish on your property goes away. It doesn't run with the land to the new owner. It's not even considered an encumbrance. It goes away if you sell the property. They cannot assign that license to another. If you give this guy a license to fish on your property, he can't go to his buddy and assign that license to his friend to let them fish on it too. Not assignable. And you can revoke it. You can give it to him, but then you can take it back and say, nope, no more fishing anymore for you. Not allowed. An encroachment, again, is an improvement, like could be a driveway, could be a fence, could be a building that crosses the property line. And the best way to figure out if there's any encroachments on a property, write this one down, is to have a survey. You should, as a broker, always advise your buyer to get a survey done. It might be $500 or $1,000 or something, but it's going to show every line, every setback line, any easements. It's going to show where the buildings sit in relation to the property line. So that's the best way to make sure encroachments don't exist. Because an encroachment across the line is going to cloud the title of both your property and your neighbor, no matter which one of you is encroaching on the other. It clouds both titles. And then pop quiz, dominant, servient, estate, and real estate. Could that servient grantee refuse the easement? Could the servient grantee refuse the easement? No, they got to allow it. Must be allowed. And that is chapter 2, guys. You did great. Good job. Covered a lot of deep material in this one, so I can appreciate if that was some points of confusion. Let me know if hopefully you've read through the material. Go back through it, review it again, hit that multiple concurrent forms of ownership, owning with other people, and hit the part about the freehold estates, inheritable and non-inheritable, and then lien theory. All of those are very testable types of things. And then, tenants in common versus joint versus the tenants by the entirety. Spend some time on all that stuff. But besides those things, a lot of this is all about terms. Level 1, knowing definitions. So you can get some easy points just by knowing definitions of words. With that, I'm going to call it. I'll see you tomorrow night. We're moving on into chapter 3 because we just finished chapter 2. Good job. I'll see you then. Put your name in the chat for me. Have a good night. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. Thanks for checking. Appreciate it, Marcus.